Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Dorsey and Whitney's webinar, Privacy Titans, Optimizing Our Neural Networks. I'd like to introduce Jamie, the chair of Dorsey's Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Social Media Practice Group. Jamie?
Welcome. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to have you with us here today. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping information. So don't forget to sign in. The materials and attendance form are available for download from the login and materials email sent from the email address events@dorsey.com. And return your completed attendance form to attendance@dorsey.com. Dorsey will apply for CLE in the jurisdictions listed here. So at the end, make sure you send in your attendance form so you can get your CLE credit. We will be giving the CLE codes if you need those in each presentation and in the chat. We won't have a lot of time for Q&A today, so because we have a lot that we're trying to present. So if you have a question, I would recommend contacting the speakers directly or your usual Dorsey contact. We do have the speaker's contact information in the materials. So today's agenda, we have 3 sessions, each 1 hour with 5-minute breaks in between. The first one will be about US data privacy law. The second one will cover international issues, and the third one will cover litigation, security incidents, and that sort of hot topic. Then we'll close by 11:50. So I would like to start our first panel. Our theme today is artificial intelligence. So you'll notice from all of the topic headings that that's what we're talking about. And you will see that flowing through all 3 of these presentations as it is affecting everything we're doing. It is interesting how we're seeing legislation about artificial intelligence and tons of legislation about privacy, and they're not really talking to each other or working too well together. So that's going to be an ongoing challenge for all of us in the years to come. Our speakers for the first panel are 4 of us: Austin Chambers, Ross Emanuele, me, and Bianca Tillman. Austin, Bianca, and I have broad privacy and cybersecurity practices. And Ross he's the co-chair of our healthcare and life sciences industry group. And so his practice is health privacy. And we'll talk about all those issues as we get going. So in February of this year, I delivered the opening talk at a privacy and cybersecurity conference. Some of you may have been there. And I talked about how at that time, bad actors only needed 1 minute of recording of your voice to do a voice clone of you. How could they get that 1 minute of recording? Well, maybe you spoke at a meeting at your firm or somewhere else where it was a video conference and it was recorded. Or maybe you gave a toast at your friend's wedding that was posted to social media. Or maybe you're an influencer and you're posting videos of yourself to the internet all the time. But they were able to train the AI system with 1 minute of recording, and then they could use a filter and have real-time phone calls with somebody where the bad actor would speak in their voice and the person who is receiving the call would hear the cloned voice. I'm also aware of a security incident that's happened where this kind of voice cloning technology was used to trick somebody who had known the person for 10 years into thinking it was someone else. Really scary, the fact that it could be so good. But I thought to myself, well, at least they can't clone my voice from my outgoing voicemail message. You know, the one that says, "Hello, you've reached Jamie Nafziger at Dorsey and Whitney. Please leave." It's too short. So, okay, at least that was one good point. Well, 2 months later, I'm now here to report that they only need 15 seconds of your voice now. And I've heard examples of these cloned voices based on 15 seconds of voice recording, and they're good. So that's a problem. And I timed my outgoing message and it was 17 seconds. So now I have a problem. And since then, we've had multiple things in the news about voice cloning. You probably heard about people getting robocalls from President Biden the night before one of our primaries saying they didn't need to bother to vote. There was also an incident in Hong Kong where somebody was asked to wire $25 million and he was suspicious about it. So he said, well, let's have a video conference. He had a video conference with several of his colleagues and was convinced that he should wire the $25 million. And it turned out after the fact that all of those video conference participants were not only voice clones, but video clones of his colleagues. So he was tricked. We also had a Wall Street Journal reporter who was interested in voice cloning. So she cloned her voice and then tried out different things. And one of the things she did was she tried calling up her bank with her voice clone and was able to get full access to her bank account using the cloned voice because of the voice ID security system that the bank had. So clearly our security, given how advanced this technology is now, our security systems need to change. We can't just rely on what we see and hear anymore as being the real person that you think you're talking to. It's probably not realistic for us to comb through the internet and remove every 15-second recording of our voice. So we have to beef up our security and find other ways to make sure that the person who's telling you to wire money or share sensitive personal information is really who they say they are. The speed of change in both privacy and AI is tremendous, and we're seeing an exponential growth in risk. We have so many developments we want to talk about today, so we're going to jump right in. But I encourage those who are watching to ponder. Am I really Jamie Nafziger, or am I a video clone saying only what my robot overlord tells me to say? These are the top issues we're going to cover in the first session. The proliferation of state laws. This is happening so fast that we're often finding that when we start a privacy project, and then when we are getting ready to finish it, the law has changed in the meantime. So it is really crazy. And you note that our invitation for this event said that there were 17 state laws, and now just in the course of a short time, we're up to 20. So it is changing really fast, and that's very challenging. We're also going to talk about artificial intelligence, which I've already teed up for us. Another big trend is how children and teens are treated in privacy and safety online, that there's just a ton of activity in that area. We're going to talk about changes in the ad tech industry, both those that they're choosing to make and those they're being forced to make. Another big trend that companies have been working on is trying to implement global privacy control or universal opt-out. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the two litigation topics, which are really key, are biometrics and these other cases, wiretapping, state constitution, common law privacy. There's a bunch of different old laws that are being used for litigation. And our third panel will be talking about those last two topics. So let's get started. I always start with federal, wishing that we might have a federal privacy law, but so far, no. There have been numerous bills proposed every year. The latest one was a couple weeks ago called the American Privacy Rights Act. You might have heard about it. It is, you may recall that the two sticking points for whether we could have a federal privacy law are two things: state preemption and a private right of action. And so the way that this bill treats those two issues is it preempts a lot of the state privacy laws, but there are quite a few exceptions to the preemption, including the Biometric Information Privacy Act in Illinois and the aspect of the California privacy law that involves statutory damages, also a genetic information privacy law in Illinois, and then a whole bunch of categories of laws that when I read it is very broad, so that I think there would be a lot of litigation over which state laws are actually preempted by this. It also does have a private right of action. but it is limited to actual damages and attorney's fees. It doesn't have a statutory damages amount. Whether this thing will take off is hard to say. You know, historically, we have not had success with that. I believe there's a hearing in the House tomorrow. This is a bill by Representative Rogers and Senator Cantwell, and we'll talk about how Senator Cantwell is planning to be very active in AI legislation this year as well. And there was some talk about how we need a privacy law before we can have all these AI laws. So, you know, this is sort of a precursor as part of her whole package that she's putting together. We also had a presidential executive order prohibiting government use of certain commercial spyware. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. We have another federal act that has passed the Senate and the House is considering this month. It's called the Report Act, and it updates the law related to online child sexual exploitation. It's more of tweaks rather than a major change, but it would require some changes by companies. So keep your eye open for that one. Now I'm going to talk about a few updates on the states that already had comprehensive privacy laws, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bianca to talk about the new state privacy laws and the health state privacy laws. So you may recall that California was the state that had the first comprehensive privacy law, and it has been operative already for several years, including the most recent amendment, the California Privacy Rights Act, which became operative last year. There were some amendments last year. One added reproductive health data and immigration data to the definition of sensitive personal information. So if you've done data mapping about California, it's time to update that with these new categories. That California Privacy Rights Act also set up the California Privacy Protection Agency. And that agency has been kind of in the getting going stage for the last year or so, but now it's fully going. So they have put out their first set of regulations. They were finalized about a year ago, and then there was a bunch of litigation that temporarily suspended them to being able to be enforced, but that is over and they are now enforceable. They also put out some final regulations in December of last year about data brokers. And they have a set of regulations that they've been working on for several months now that are likely to be finalized this year, including some on insurance, revisions to the existing regulations they had, the automated decision-making, which is like the AI type regulations, and then on privacy risk assessments. Kind of in the later category are cybersecurity audits. They also are working on regulations related to that. They recently put out their first enforcement advisory, which you can find on their website. It's about data minimization related to consumer requests. So if you're getting requests from people about their privacy rights, this relates to what types of information should you be collecting from them and what should you be doing with it. They also launched a resource site and a new complaint form. Last year's enforcement was still all by the state attorney general in California. Now we're kind of in a model where we have 3 enforcers. People can have a private right of action on certain claims. We can have the state AG enforcing it, and we can have that privacy agency enforcing it. But last year, the California AG had streaming services on his radar. He settled 2 cases, one related to location privacy and another on patient health information. And he was sending information requests to employers about employee privacy. There were lawsuits about security incidents. There were over 100 of them in 2023, so pretty active. California has a data broker registration requirement, and each year, more and more companies register as data brokers. We're up to almost 550. They also passed the Age-Appropriate Design Code, which is a children's privacy law modeled after the UK Age-Appropriate Design Code. That law has faced some litigation trouble. It currently has a preliminary injunction against it, which has been appealed to the Ninth Circuit. So we'll be watching that. They passed the California Delete Act last October, and this relates to that data broker registry because most people don't really have a direct interaction with data brokers. This Delete Act sets up a system where if you're a California consumer, you could submit one request to have something happen with all of your personal information at all of the data brokers in that data broker registry. It's not operating yet. It will be in 2026, but I think that's a trend that we will see in other states as well. Now turning to Virginia, which also went into effect early last year. They had one amendment last year, which was protection of genetic data privacy. And they also passed some children's privacy amendments this year, which went to the governor, but the governor returned the amendments to the legislature, and they're having hearings this month. So we'll have to watch the children's privacy developments in Virginia to see where that all turns out. Next, Colorado. So Colorado finalized their regulations last year, and they posted some additional compliance resources for people and businesses on their website. I mentioned the global privacy control, or the universal opt-out mechanism. That's basically a requirement under several states' laws where you have to set it up so that if somebody sets a certain setting in their browser, when they come to your website, they are treated as if they've opted out of tracking through these cookies. So the Colorado Attorney General had a period where he evaluated different opt-out mechanisms to see which ones he would approve. I think he looked at 3 or 4 of them, and he ultimately only approved one, which is the global privacy control. So that is required to be implemented in Colorado by July 1st of this year. And if you have questions about it, please feel free to contact us. He did start enforcing the Colorado privacy law, and he started sending out educational letters last July. There are several amendments underway this year of the Colorado Privacy Act, so we'll see which ones of those are enacted. Next, Connecticut. We still have a 60-day right to cure problems with compliance until the end of this year in Connecticut. But I think the most interesting thing that happened there was the Attorney General put out a report after 6 months of dealing with the Connecticut privacy law. And what I think is really interesting about this is it signals what we might see in other states as states learn what are the good parts of these privacy laws and what might need improvement. So he talked about his enforcement activities, including a letter he sent to a data broker that was allegedly selling health data to cremation companies, which is definitely on the high creepy level. But the interesting part is his suggestions for the legislature, and you'll see the themes here in some of the other privacy laws we'll talk about. One of the big challenges for companies is that the exemptions from these state privacy laws are all over the map. Like every state is slightly different. So we've got some states that will exempt an entire healthcare organization if they're subject to HIPAA in some part of their business. Others will only exempt the HIPAA covered data. And some exempt nonprofits, some don't. Same with financial information. So he wants Connecticut to not have these entity level exemptions, but only have the data level exemptions. He also wants them to enact a one-stop deletion mechanism for data brokers, like I just talked about in California. Also wants companies to have to disclose the exact list of their third parties that they're sharing personal information with rather than categories. And he wants to broaden the definition of biometric data to match organs. So you'll see, those are his 4 things that he's really pointing out after 6 months of dealing with it. They also enacted a lot of amendments in Connecticut last year. I don't have time to go through all of them, but the topics are listed here. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bianca to talk about the newer state privacy laws. Bianca?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jamie. So picking up where Jamie left off, here, as stated on the slide, many states have been considering comprehensive privacy bills, and those listed here on the slide have been passed, and we can expect them in the coming months and years. Generally, each comprehensive state privacy law will apply if your organization does business in the state or produces, targets, delivers goods or services to residents of the state, and typically comes with a minimum revenue threshold or number of users threshold. For example, the CCPA in California applies to your corporation or organization if you have an annual gross revenue in excess of $25 million in the preceding year, or alone or in combination annually buys, sells, or shares the personal information of 100,000 or more consumers or households, or your organization derives 50% or more of its annual revenue from selling or sharing personal information. Again, each state is slightly different with different exceptions and what have you. Next slide. And as many comprehensive state privacy laws exclude or exempt nonprofit organizations, it's important to note that certain states do actually apply to nonprofits or will soon in the coming months. So we have the Colorado Privacy Act, which came into effect in July of 2023, which applies to nonprofits. In Delaware, we have the Personal Data Privacy Act, which comes into effect January 2025. Oregon has the Consumer Data Privacy Act, which comes into effect in 2025 as well. And then in Connecticut, Washington, and Nevada, we have consumer health data privacy laws that also apply to nonprofit organizations. Next slide. Here we can really kind of see the breakdown of these comprehensive state privacy laws and consumer health data privacy laws, and then states that have either both or a privacy law that covers both categories of data. In Connecticut, for example, Senate Bill 3 amended the Connecticut Data Privacy Act to include certain obligations and restrictions on processing, sharing, and selling of consumer health data that is not otherwise regulated by HIPAA. In California, on top of the CCPA, California passed Assembly Bills 352 and 254 last year. This was in response to the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. And essentially, these new bills apply to organizations such as EHR developers, digital health companies, and will have certain requirements such as limiting out-of-state medical information disclosure or limiting cooperation with out-of-state inquiries and investigations into things like reproductive health care and gender-affirming care. And then finally, in Maryland, just earlier this week, they enacted a law similarly that limits the sharing of health information outside of the state and has certain guidelines around sensitive health information. Next slide. Now, focusing a little bit more into Washington State and the My Health, My Data Act, this law passed last year in 2023. And although it's called a consumer health data privacy law, the way that the law is written, it contains very broad definitions. For example, the word collection means buying, renting, accessing, retaining, receiving, acquiring, inferring, deriving, or otherwise processing consumer health data. So it really covers any sort of act that a company is doing with consumer health data. Furthermore, the act applies whether you are applies to residents of Washington State, as well as data that is hosted and processed in Washington State. As many of you know, some of the biggest tech companies in the world are located here in Washington, many of the biggest data hubs. So certainly data is being processed here in Washington. Furthermore, the My Health, My Data Act has very broad definitions of what actually constitutes consumer health data. So for example, here, the definition of biometric data will include things such as voice recordings and imagery of the face. It also covers things like precise location data. So often covering companies that may not traditionally consider themselves in the healthcare industry. For example, a corner store or a gas station that sells over-the-counter medication may be in scope for the law. A fitness center or a community rec center that allows people to purchase memberships will all be covered by the law. And finally, Washington State has a geofencing ban where you're prohibited from implementing a geofence of 2,000 feet around a location providing healthcare services. This law has a private right of action with steep civil penalties, and it went into effect on March 31st of this year. So we haven't seen any enforcement actions just yet in the news, but we anticipate those coming soon. Next slide. Nevada has a similar consumer health data privacy law. It is not as robust as Washington. The definitions of consumer health data are slightly narrower, and for companies, there is no private right of action. Instead, this law is enforced by the Attorney General of Nevada. Next slide. So in order to comply with these consumer health data privacy laws, there are additional steps that need to be taken, even if you're already complying with laws like CCPA or the CPA in Colorado or any of these comprehensive privacy laws. So in order to comply with the consumer health data privacy laws, typically a new consumer health data privacy policy is required with a distinct footer link that links to this disclosure. New affirmative consent needs to be obtained for the new collection, use, or sharing. There are certain restrictions on access to consumer health data that need to be implemented within the organization. Reasonable security measures need to be enforced. Organizations also have to enter agreements or DPAs with their vendors if they are handling consumer health data, and specific consent from users for the selling or sharing of consumer health data is also required. So typically, a whole new sort of set of requirements to comply with these different laws. Next slide.
Thank you, Bianca. So that was great on the health laws. I'm turning now to children's privacy, and really I could speak for hours about this because so many things have been going on. It has, I guess it falls into a few different categories, but there's definitely some overlapping. This slide is about age verification laws that have been passing in states for websites that have adult content. You can see a list of them here. The newest one was Florida, which was just signed March 25th. But several of these you'll note are enjoined or partially enjoined, and there's been a lot of litigation about these laws. I will say that they have been enacted and effective enough that Pornhub just pulled out of Texas completely as a result of this law. So it's definitely something to pay attention to if you are a site that has adult content. The other trend we've been seeing is the increasing age of consent. So if you're familiar with the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, that governs online collection of personal information from kids under the age of 13. But what we're seeing in these states is that these ages are going up, and many more teens are covered by the laws. So California and Connecticut enacted laws that had kids between 13 and 15 had to give you opt-in consent to use their data with certain types of processing. Then New Jersey came along and made it 13 to 16, had the opt-in consent. Connecticut has amendments that make it 13 to 17. And then the California Age Appropriate Design Code, which I mentioned before, which has been enjoined currently, relates to websites likely to be accessed by children under 18. And then the most controversial, maybe besides the California Act, is the new Maryland Act, which has the language that the website knew or should have known that it had people under 18. That is a departure from everything in the past, and is likely to be extremely controversial. Also, if you've been following the Federal Trade Commission, they approve parental consent mechanisms for children's privacy, and they just had before them the opportunity to approve a new parental consent mechanism that was age estimation software, which is popular in Europe, and they did not approve that. So that was rejected so far, but they could always bring it up again. The social media state laws you've probably heard about these in the news. Some of the states have really tried to restrict kids and teens' use of social media. Utah had an act that it tried to implement and was immediately sued, and now it has repealed and replaced it just last month. It requires you to implement age assurance of whether somebody's under 18 that is 95% accurate. So that's going to be a challenge. And then it has a bunch of other requirements, including default privacy settings for teens and supervisory tools for parents. Arkansas had a similar law that has been blocked in the courts. Texas has a law. Ohio, that one has a TRO that's been issued against it. Florida just passed a really broad law that says kids under 14 can't have social media accounts. Georgia passed one, Tennessee passed one, but all of these are facing court cases. So where this all shakes out in the coming months or years remains to be seen. But if you are a social media site, you should definitely be paying attention to this development. There were tons of other new state privacy laws passed last year. I have some categories here, but we don't really have time to go into all of them. But it's just like every month, it feels like years worth of legislation coming our way. The Federal Trade Commission is also looking at the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Their comment period just closed last month, and there are, I think, over 700 comments. They also issued guidance on a bunch of other issues, which I've listed here that you might want to check out. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was also active on privacy with a bunch of guidance for companies in the financial area. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ross to talk about health information privacy.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks everyone for joining. Again, I'm Ross Emanuele. I'm a healthcare lawyer, and I work in the healthcare privacy and security space. I'm going to talk about Part 2 rules, which are privacy rules relating to substance use disorder patient records. Talk about an important case in Minnesota related to a state, Minnesota's Health Records Act, and also make a couple comments on that and a CMS development involving references to HIPAA. I'm going to make some comments on cybersecurity and healthcare, and then talk about the FTC's work in the health area. But to start off, the Part 2 rules are a set of federal privacy rules that have been around for many decades, much longer than the HIPAA rules, and they were amended in February of this past year to largely, but not entirely, align them with the HIPAA rules. So from an enforcement standpoint, from a breach notification standpoint, and from the notice of privacy practices, which if you are a HIPAA covered entity, you know what that is. It's the notice that you get at the doctor's office or at the hospital that shows all the ways they can use and disclose protected health information. These modifications to the substance use disorder rules align with HIPAA, so it's enforced the same. You can basically use the same sort of notice of privacy practices, and the breach notification rules are the same. The other big piece that the SUD or the Part 2 rules modified was to allow for a single written consent from a substance use disorder patient to allow for all of the treatment, payment, and healthcare operations disclosures that are permitted under HIPAA. The difference is you still need a consent from the patient. Under HIPAA, you don't. You can just, a covered entity can make disclosures for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations without the need for a consent. A Part 2 program has to get a written consent from a patient for these disclosures, and the consent doesn't need to be given. A patient could not sign the consent. They could revoke the consent later on. So that is a big difference still between the HIPAA rules and the Part 2 rules. Furthermore, every disclosure made with the patient's consent, including for treatment, patient, and healthcare operations, must be accompanied either with a summary of the consent, a clear explanation of the consent, or a copy of the consent. And that has to follow all the way downstream for any disclosures to a vendor, to a subcontractor, to anyone that the Part 2 program discloses to. In addition, there are still some disclosures that are more restrictive under the Part 2 rules than under the HIPAA rules, particularly any disclosures that involve any proceeding of any type against the SUD patient. The reason being that the rules are designed to prevent anyone from being disadvantaged by their decision to get treatment for substance use disorder versus someone who doesn't seek consent. And so there are still reasons for integrated systems that are covered entities under HIPAA, but have a Part 2 program within them to segregate the data and allow that data to be managed separately, because there are still some more additional restrictions that are more restrictive than HIPAA, and it's possible that some patients may not provide the consent or revoke the consent later on. So it doesn't entirely align with HIPAA, but it is a significant alignment with HIPAA that for those types of integrated systems should help tremendously. To move on, there is an important case in Minnesota from the Supreme Court about the Minnesota Health Records Act that also effectively aligns the permitted disclosures under the Minnesota Health Records Act with HIPAA's permitted disclosures. There was a disclosure from a hospital to its related fundraising foundation, which was clearly permitted under the HIPAA privacy rule. There's no doubt about that, and no one in the case suggested otherwise. But the plaintiffs argued that although permitted under HIPAA, it was not permitted under the Minnesota Health Records Act, which does have a private right of action. So they brought a claim, and the key issue was whether the Minnesota Health Records Act language that states that a provider regulated under that statute may not release a patient's health records without consent or specific authorization in law references or includes any HIPAA permitted disclosures. So is a disclosure permitted under HIPAA a specific authorization law under the Minnesota Health Records Act? And the Minnesota Supreme Court said definitively it is. So the Supreme Court said that that language, specific authorization in law, encompasses all law that is binding and enforceable in Minnesota, including federal law. So what that effectively means is that permitted disclosures of PHI under HIPAA are also authorized releases of health records under the Minnesota Health Records Act. Again, there is a private right of action under the Minnesota Health Records Act. So I think that what this means is that if someone wants to bring a claim under the Minnesota Health Records Act, they effectively, one of the things that they have to show is that that disclosure was not permitted under HIPAA, because if it was permitted under HIPAA, then there was a specific authorization in law for that disclosure, which means that Minnesota courts are going to be, or likely to be, asked to interpret HIPAA, even though there is no private right of action under HIPAA, and OCR may not have taken any enforcement action against the provider. So there may not be any external so to speak, reference to or finding that there's been a disclosure that's not permitted under HIPAA. Minnesota courts are going to be asked likely to determine whether there was. There is legislation that has already been proposed, and it's moving its way, at least through the Minnesota Senate, to reverse this decision and to add language to the Minnesota Health Records Act that the specific authorization has to be in Minnesota law. But we'll see if that passes. If we move on, there is also a statement from CMS, which administers a Medicare program, and CMS has a set of what are called conditions of participation that all hospitals have to meet to continue to be enrolled and participate in the Medicare program. One of those conditions of participation has to do with hospital medical records, and it says that those records have to be accurate, properly completed, properly filed, retained, accessible, and that the hospital has to use a system of author identification and maintenance that ensures the integrity of the authentication and protects the security of all record entries. Effectively, a hospital has to show that it has to have a system that can confirm that when someone makes an entry in a medical record, that entry is appropriate. It is the person that the entry says it was, and that there is security around record entries. And this raises the point that's been around for a few years now of how do hospitals who use a texting platform for members of the care team to communicate with each other do that, and can they do that and comply with these conditions of participation? And a recent CMS memo indicates that they can, but it also says that it must be performed through a HIPAA-compliant secure texting platform, and that hospitals should implement processes to routinely assess the security integrity of the testing systems and platforms utilized. So again, there's a reference to HIPAA from another federal agency, and I think it is appropriate for CMS to allow secure texting platforms to allow communication among care team members. But the question that I think is really interesting is if CMS if there is an incident involving texting and CMS wants to find that there was a conditions of participation violation, but OCR has not acted, can CMS find that a hospital's texting platform was not HIPAA compliant or was not used in a HIPAA compliant manner? Similar to the Minnesota courts being asked to interpret the Minnesota Health Records Act, as I talked about with the Minnesota Supreme Court case, I think it is possible that in the future CMS, because of this memo and this new guidance, may find itself in a position of having to interpret whether a texting platform or the way that a hospital used a texting platform complied with HIPAA or not, even though OCR, which is ostensibly the only federal agency that can force HIPAA, has not made a finding that there's been a violation. I want to talk about for a couple minutes what I think is a really important issue for the healthcare industry at the moment, which is cybersecurity. I don't have any slides on this, but there has been a couple developments recently. First, that are indicators of what I think could be a regulatory approach for security in the healthcare industry. The New York Department of Health has proposed very specific regulations for hospitals around cybersecurity that sets very specific standards around a security compliance program, a security officer, auditing and monitoring, authentication of individuals that use systems, risk assessments, training, data incidents, and reporting. And it is specific to the point that there is a standard, at least in the proposed rule, of course, could be changed, that a New York hospital that suffers a security incident that has a material adverse impact on any hospital, on the hospital or a material hospital system, has to notify the New York Department of Health within 2 hours of that incident. Okay. Another development is that HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, has put out specific guidance on the security rule. Those who work with HIPAA know that the HIPAA security rule is scalable, flexible, it's technology neutral. It does not stipulate what any particular hospital, doctor's office, pharmacy, lab, what have you, type of provider that's covered entity has to do. It just sets out a set of standards, and you have to act reasonably and diligently to implement those standards in a way that's appropriate for your organization. HHS has put out a set of guidance on implementing compliance with the security rule. There's much more detailed and specific, and sets out specific questions and tasks that covered entities can do to comply with the security rule. That is welcome. I think for the most part, it's good guidance. But I think combined with the New York hospital proposed rules, which may be replicated in many states, in other states in the future, and this more detailed guidance from HHS may be a harbinger of more specific security rules that are not as technology neutral, that set specifications for covered entities. I think we are starting to move in that direction, and I think the reason for it is that because of the way that the compliance with the security rule has been enforced, and the fact that the security rules are so technology neutral and scalable and flexible, it has, for many parts of the healthcare industry, allowed covered entities to not do what they should be doing from a cybersecurity standpoint. Not all, of course, covered entities, but I think we all know that there are many covered entities that don't do comprehensive risk assessments every year. They don't do many of the things that they should do. And I think that a combination of the security rules being flexible and the fact that enforcement of the security rule really happens after the fact, if there is in fact a reported security breach, has allowed that to happen. So my comment would be that now is the time for covered entities to focus on cybersecurity and really come to the realization that cybersecurity is not ancillary or corollary to their core mission of treating patients. It is absolutely core. It is nearly, if not as core, to a provider's mission to furnish quality clinical care to patients as clinical safety. If providers are so dependent on information flowing among care teams to payers to others, that when those shut down, that is a patient safety issue. So again, my comment would be now is the time to take this seriously, do comprehensive, thorough quality risk assessments, take the HHS guidance seriously and implement it. And if the regulation continues to be more specific on the cybersecurity standpoint, from a cybersecurity standpoint, those covered entities, providers that do that are going to be in a better position. Okay, let me finish with Federal Trade Commission enforcement in the health industry. If we could go to the next slide. So the Federal Trade Commission also enforces in the healthcare industry. There is an FTC health data breach notification rule. GoodRx was enforced against by the FTC for failing to comply with that rule. Other healthcare apps and services that are not covered entities, because either they are an app that you just pay for out of pocket, or it's a counseling service that they pay for out of pocket, have been enforced against for not being truthful or omitting important facts about how they share data for advertising, how they disclose it to third parties. So there have been significant penalties and enforcement actions in that area. And a genetic testing service, again, not a covered entity because all the payment is out of pocket. They don't deal with payers, was enforced against because they did not tell in their privacy policy users of their service accurate information about how their data is deleted. They changed their privacy policy retroactively, and instead of making those changes only with regard to the data that was submitted or that they collected, after they made the change, they went back and retroactively changed it for the data that they already had without obtaining their consent. And so for those in the healthcare industry who avoid HIPAA regulation, it is not by no means the fact that you are free from federal privacy and security regulation, in addition to all the state laws that Jamie and Bianca have talked about before. And, you know, HIPAA is 20 years old. And when HIPAA started out, many, many organizations, particularly those who provided some services to health plans or health care providers, did sort of gymnastics to try to avoid HIPAA regulation and to minimize the impact or where within, you know, the sets of programs or divisions or business units within their organization were regulated by HIPAA, because there was nothing else. And so if you could avoid HIPAA regulation, you were basically avoiding privacy and security regulation. That is no longer the case with all of the state laws and all the things that we've talked about to this point. So that risk-benefit analysis of whether it's better to avoid HIPAA regulation than not, I think for many organizations would probably change at this point. So that's my last comment, and I will turn it over to Austin.
Great, thanks, Ross. Welcome, everybody. And so the FTC, aside from enforcing against healthcare companies not subject to HIPAA, they're of course very active across different domains and are probably the most robust federal regulator for privacy and data security issues. And interestingly, over the last several years, the FTC tends to work in terms of settlement agreements. So they enforce against unfair or deceptive trade practices for companies, which has been interpreted to include privacy or security violations. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a few trends, which interestingly sort of align with what we've seen at the state level. So I'm going to cover kind of like some of the larger, more significant Federal Trade Commission settlements over the last year or so. So again, aligning with sort of the state's children have been a huge focus for the FTC. The FTC is the enforcer of HIPAA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. So these, again, not under their unfair deceptive trade practice authority, but again, just for enforcement of HIPAA. But again, FTC has been very robust, very active here under enforcing HIPAA. So first, the big one, Microsoft was fined $20 million for violations of HIPAA here. This involved Microsoft not obtaining verifiable parental consent, which is required when you collect data from children under 13. Here, this relates to Xbox Live accounts. So basically, children were able to go and create an Xbox Live account. They could provide account information, an avatar, and some other information. And Microsoft was able to collect all of that information and then basically said, please involve a parent before you, and to get consent. But they never actually obtained that verifiable parental consent. So FTC, of course, found out about that, and they have forced Microsoft to delete that data and go and seek parental consent in addition to the fine. Amazon also, everyone is familiar with Echo, so Amazon's Echo device was collecting information from children, and Alexa, the service, also embedded in other children's or children-targeted devices. So Alexa was again collecting all of this information from children. Amazon did not disclose that clearly to parents, and also did not delete that data. So there were issues that basically, if a parent did eventually come around and say, I want you to delete my children's data, Amazon failed to do so. And so again, FTC stepped in and just stopped to that, and again required Amazon to delete children's information and to put in a new process to delete that information more quickly on a go-forward basis. Sort of the last major case under HIPAA with FTC is this Edmodo case, which was an edtech vendor. So this was a first for FTC recently. It was really focusing on edtech providers. So in this case, although schools are able to collect parental consent on behalf of parents, basically through an authorization, they failed to do so. They failed to provide notice to parents about how they were collecting data, what they were going to do with it. And once again, we see FTC requiring that Edmodo destroy data as one of the remedies, and of course collect only what is minimally necessary to provide the service. Next up, another big focus area and kind of an interesting development here with respect to biometrics. So in this case, the FTC alleged under its unfair deceptive trade practice authority that Rite Aid failed to implement reasonable measures to prevent harms in relation to use of biometric technology. Essentially, Rite Aid was collecting biometric information, usually face scans, in connection with certain services that it offered. But what was interesting is that they didn't provide, so they failed to implement reasonable measures to prevent harm. They didn't assess the harms that might come of it. And what is very interesting about this case in particular is that FTC, as part of its authority, required that Rite Aid not only delete the data that they collected, which was the face scan, they also had to delete all the models and all of the training data that were generated through the facial recognition models. So this was a comprehensive sort of deletion of data remedy. So again, very, very important to watch. And we saw this again a couple of years ago with the Ever album case. Again, this was facial recognition, facial identification in a photo album. Again, same remedy was sought by FTC, required the disgorgement of both the underlying data as well as the models and training data related to that. So the last focus area for FTC has been sort of location data, and we can kind of expand this out to data brokerage and data aggregation, really getting at basically consumers not knowing or not consenting to the collection and sharing of certain sensitive information, be that precise location information or browsing data, or other sorts of data that these data brokers in the background are collecting, aggregating, and selling about people in the background. So this, again, sort of FTC's attempt to continue to pull that thread the states are to have as well around data brokerage, and really trying to get more transparency and to start to crack down and limit the purchase and sale of information around consumers, but in particular sensitive information such as browsing data, location data, things like that. Next slide, please. Sort of again at the federal level, surveillance is an important issue, as it has been for a number of years. One of the developments that we have is Executive Order 14086. I won't spend a lot of time on what this is. This is basically an update to FISA Section 702, which is one of the main federal laws authorizing foreign surveillance. What's important about this change is that the changes that were made by executive order have allowed the data privacy framework, which is the European EU-US data transfer mechanism. So for many years, of course, there's been a lot of challenges around data transfers between Europe and the United States. These changes significantly curtailed, at least allegedly, the ability for the US surveillance authorities to monitor and collect data in bulk around non-US persons, at least those in Europe and qualifying states. And so with that, it has also given these qualifying states, such as Europe, an ability to basically complain and seek redress through the Data Protection Review Court. All of these changes, again, allowed the data privacy framework to take effect. And it, of course, has been challenged in Europe again, but now there at least is a mechanism similar to Privacy Shield, for those of you who are familiar, that is back in effect at the federal level. Of course, FISA itself is up for reauthorization. This is sort of a developing issue. I believe at last check, the amendments have passed the House, but of course it faces an uncertain path in the future with numerous senators and others trying to seek further amendments or to kill reauthorization of FISA. So something I would continue to watch in the coming year. Next slide, please. And again, at the federal level, again, following the thread of several states who have attempted to ban social media, and we have the TikTok ban, which is attempting to force a sale of TikTok and from its Chinese parent company, and would also ban TikTok from US app stores. Again, this faces considerable both political and constitutional obstacles, but again, something to watch, especially as these constitutional challenges develop. And as I think we'll talk about a little bit later, at the federal level, we've seen an executive order 14117, which is banning sensitive data transfers, but again, really getting at AI and the sharing of information about consumers with companies in certain states, such as China. So stay tuned to panel 2 for more on that. Next slide. Back over to you, Jim.
So speaking about artificial intelligence very briefly here, I wanted to just highlight a couple points about it. And one of them is that there are lawsuits pending now about how AI systems have been trained, and the fact that when they scraped information off of the internet, it contained a lot of people's personal information, and that potentially users asking AI systems for things can get information about other users. It's important to make sure that the default settings of your employees, if they're using AI, are set so that it's not training on the information that they're inputting. Secondly, there's a lot of questions about how the AI systems could train on people's personal information when we've got federal and state privacy laws that require prior consent. So, for example, if you collect sensitive data or data about a known child in Colorado, you have to get opt-in consent before that. If you're just scraping off the entire internet, how could you have done that? So I've put some questions on this slide that will be likely addressed in many of these lawsuits. most of us are dealing with contracts related to AI, and there's a lot of issues there in terms of risk allocation between the parties, all these unknown issues about scraping and training and output and who's going to be on the hook for those, making sure your insurance covers you. And then are your planned new AI uses consistent with the privacy representations in your privacy policy? If not, you may need to revise your privacy policy and get new consent from people. And do you need new data processing agreements related to AI? Probably you do. Finally, are your uses that you're planning to do consistent with the AI providers' policies? So for instance, ChatGPT in their policy has a prohibition of using it for certain financial or medical advice. So are you planning to try to use it for something that they don't permit you to do by contract? You probably heard about an executive order about artificial intelligence in the US that is this massive, many hundred of page document. I've put a link here to an executive order timeline, which kind of breaks out where we are. I think we just passed the 150-day mark, and each agency has certain deadlines, but one of the things specifically mentioned in the executive order is promoting privacy. So we're likely to see more regulation this year. The Federal Trade Commission, as Austin was talking about and Ross was talking about, has also been active in AI. They've had several announcements about AI, which I've listed here. And the Department of Commerce has been active with AI. I specifically recommend checking out the Artificial Intelligence Risk Management Framework from NIST. And the states have been super active. There are over a dozen state AI laws, multiple regulations, and many more to come. Federal legislation, I'm just going to skip and turn it back over to Austin here.
Thanks, Jamie. So I think one of the last things we wanted to cover here is sort of the private industry developments. So alongside CCPA and the other state privacy laws, kind of one of the big focuses really is around ad tech and behavioral advertising. And so this is sort of dovetailing with a lot of developments in the ad tech space itself, both designed to address the compliance challenges around the state privacy laws, and also just to, again, create a more privacy protected product. So Google, probably the biggest player in ad tech, has started to make several significant changes. So this is, for those of you familiar, this is Google Analytics 4 GA4. It has replaced Universal Analytics, which is sort of the prior version. What is important about this is that this is a cookieless type solution, or they're really trying to move away from third-party cookies, which allows tracking of user behavior across multiple sites. They're using instead predictive analytics and other sorts of information collection that are a little bit less deterministic, a little bit less linked back to an individual, but again, designed to still give you the analytics information you want about how people use your website. The important thing, of course, here is that there are cases with GA4 that allows data sharing with Google and cross-site tracking if users opt in. And so it does require some work on the implementation side to make sure that Google Analytics has been implemented in a manner compliant with the state privacy laws and in compliance with Google's own contractual requirements in terms of service. Similarly, Google Ads, moving cookieless here, again, really trying to end third-party cookies, browser fingerprinting, all these sorts of privacy invasive sorts of methods for collecting advertising information. So they're moving to what is called a privacy sandbox, which is collecting data and storing it within a browser and not sharing it. But basically, advertisers can access a sort of on-browser set of information and then target ads to users that way. So again, things to watch, again, things to monitor and make sure that these are being implemented in compliance with Google's requirements and applicable law. Next slide, please. Also in the advertising space, IAB, one of the largest trade organizations, has rolled out its multi-state privacy agreement. This is a sort of comprehensive set of tools that allows for people who sign up to basically pass through opt-out signals throughout the display advertising chains. This is similar to the TCF, which is in Europe. Again, both of them trying to get all of the vendors in the ad tech space on the same page and respecting user choice around opt-out with ads. Again, implementation challenges abound, but certainly something to pay attention to if you are engaging in or in retargeting or behavioral advertising or display advertising. Next slide, please. And then finally, in relation to cookies, sort of layered on top of all the compliance and contractual challenges we have with this emerging litigation. We'll talk a lot more about this in the third panel, but just be aware that there are increasing claims in California under old wiretap laws, alleging that advertising technologies, in particular social media pixels, involve wiretapping. So stay tuned in the third panel for more information about that. Next slide, please.
So we're going to wrap up here. We've put some key issues for 2024 on this slide. We're likely to have more and more state laws. We're up to 20, and I expect we'll be at a higher number before the end of the year. So working on complying with those laws is going to be a really high priority item for all US companies. We think we'll see more health data laws like the ones Bianca talked about in reaction to Dobbs, and we'll likely have the Venn diagram that she showed change over the year. All the AI challenges, voice cloning, deep fakes, and our election is likely to be a very important issue this year. What do you do about AI that's been trained on stuff that maybe it shouldn't have been trained on? I think we're going to see requirements to have machine unlearning and disgorgement, like some of the FTC proceedings that Ross and Austin talked about. And then I mentioned at the beginning the overlapping and somewhat inconsistent requirements between privacy and AI laws that we're seeing in the states. Third-party cookies, Austin covered, it's going to be increasingly difficult to use them in a legally compliant way, and the risk of using them and the litigation associated with them is increasing. Children's privacy laws, many changes to HIPAA, more state laws, more constitutional challenges, just a lot of activity. Health-related, enforcement related to pixels and other trackers in a similar way as we were talking about with other websites. We'll see dark patterns enforcement and the wiretapping cases continue. Now we are going to take a short break and we will resume at 9:40 or whatever hour 40 that you're on. Thanks so much for this first panel, and we'll look forward to the international panel coming up. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to turn now to our second panel of the day, on diffusion models, international privacy updates. And I would like to introduce our panelists and also encourage them to say anything else they want about their practices. We have Ray Liu from our Beijing office. Ray is the office head of Beijing and also works with privacy and cybersecurity issues with many of his technology clients there. Ron Moscona is a partner in our London office and is very active with privacy in the EU and the UK and with artificial intelligence issues and the many new EU laws about online platforms and technology. We have Dave Townsend, who's in our government solutions and investigations practice group, and he's one of our international trade experts who's going to be talking about some of the international trade issues that have come up related to privacy, which will be key for companies, especially who have US-China business. And then Jeanette Wong is a partner in our Hong Kong office, and she practices in a number of different areas, including online, a bunch of different online issues, including payment scams, and she's going to be talking about that. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for participating. Here's all of our wonderful speakers, and we will turn it over to Dave to start.
Great, thanks, Jamie. I'm going to be covering the some recent developments related to data transfers from the United States internationally. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start out by covering a little bit on the legal architecture that gives rise to this development, talk about the object and purpose and why these rules are being proposed, including why they're being proposed now. And then we'll just sort of walk through what the proposed rules are and how they may impact different companies. So I'm Dave Townsend. I'm an attorney here in Minneapolis. specializing in national security issues. From a national security perspective, the recent developments are following a trend of increasing attention to information communications technology as well as data. So there was an executive order issued at the end of February called Preventing Access to Americans' Bulk Sensitive Data and U.S. government-related data by countries of concern. And the rest of what I'm going to talk about today is basically outlining a proposed rule that the Department of Justice published on March 5th that would implement that executive order, EO 14117. And so although from a national security perspective, this is a development that makes a certain amount of sense relative to the other communications and data priorities that have become a central focus of the US government from a data privacy perspective and a data transaction perspective. It's a pretty broad and sweeping proposal from the Department of Justice that I think a lot of companies and a lot of industries will want to keep an eye on. Next slide. So why are we looking at this issue and why are we looking at it now? There are a couple of case scenarios that I think policymakers all agree on need to be addressed. And I've briefly summarized these here. One was a case of a fitness training app revealing the locations of military personnel outside of the United States. You don't have to be imaginative to understand why that's problematic. There's also this article from the New York Times where the authors basically purchased data on the open market and then did a bunch of research and analysis of that data, which allowed them to track US military officials, law enforcement, and high-profile attorneys as they went about their day-to-day and private business. And so these all give rise to really central is US government data and potential issues that could come up for US national security related to transfer of that data outside the United States. Next slide. So the entirety of what this rule would address is data transfers about US persons from the United States to a non-US location. And the purpose and intent of the DOJ proposed rule would be to do something about the case scenarios that we looked at on the last slide, including tracking of individuals such as the military and federal law enforcement. But also in terms of the timing, I think the rapid increase of artificial intelligence and LLMs have really fueled a sense of urgency in the US government that they need to do something on this front. And if you look at the DOJ proposed rule, which we provide a link to on that second slide, you'll see at the beginning of it, them talking about those use case scenarios that we mentioned, but also the fact that AI sort of enhances all of this risk, sort of exponentially, right? Because you have the ability now to train platforms to analyze data at speeds that were previously sort of unheard of. And that access to bulk data, both for training an AI platform, but also in terms of actually using the data itself, can compound the risk to US national security. And national security, I think, defined not only as national security from the US government perspective, but also in the corporate sector, allowing US companies' data to be used in ways that are inimical to US national security. Next slide. So getting into the architecture of the rule, a couple things about this rule. One is that the way DOJ has proposed the rule, it would require companies to look at the rule and determine for themselves whether a particular transaction is restricted or prohibited. And if they get it wrong, if they violate what would be the rule, then there would be penalties under US law for a company or an individual that violated the rule. And so you really just have to work through the key definitions of the rule if you're a compliance specialist or an individual to figure out whether the kinds of transactions you're looking at undertaking would be subject to a prohibition or a restriction. And obviously, because it's only a proposed rule, it's important to remember all of these concepts are under further review and subject to change. And the Department of Justice is going to publish a proposed rule, which I think is due at the end of August, and then there'll be a final rule. And so the prohibitions and restrictions we're talking about here wouldn't go into effect until the effective date of that final rule. But you see here the different kinds of data that would be subject to restrictions. There's two broad categories. One is sensitive bulk data, which we outlined. There's 6 subtypes of that. And then another is US government data. With respect to the sensitive bulk data, you can see there that there are particular types of industries that are sort of more targeted for restriction here. The personal identifiers is pretty broadly defined and would capture, I think, a lot of companies in the software or software app space. And then you see like the biometric identifiers and the genomic data is more targeted to health data and companies in the biotech space, as well as the personal financial data, obviously, is more looking at the financial sector and banking sector. Next slide. So again, key definitions here. Countries of concern you see listed here. This is only the beginning in the sense that I think as time goes on, DOJ and the enforcement agencies are likely to add to this. And then a covered person, that is a person to whom data transactions are restricted or prohibited, is defined here. And it's fairly common sense, although it does cover broadly entities that are 50% or more owned by a country of concern or have their principal place of business in a country of concern. And then US persons are defined there, again, sort of intuitively, but the broad structure here is that's regulating transactions relating and involving data from US persons to covered persons with a focus on the countries of concern. Next slide. Transaction is very broadly defined, but there is also this limitation in the proposed rule that it would target bulk data transactions. And what is bulk data? Well, it would capture data as low as 100 or as high as 1 million US persons, which if you're involved heavily in data, that's a pretty small number, even on the high side, again, subject to change. And then it would regulate or prohibit specific kinds of transactions involving bulk sensitive data or US government data. We'll look at more at that on the next slide. There are exempted transactions, which are really important for particular industries. Exempted are personal communications and informational materials. There's also a pretty broad carve out for financial services and payment processing if you're in the financial and banking sector. Next slide. So here are the 4 kinds of agreements that would be subject to prohibitions or restrictions under the rule. You have data brokerage agreements, which is like selling data that's collected to another person. You have vendor agreements, someone providing goods or services, employment agreements, again, sort of intuitively defined in investment agreements, where somebody takes an investment stake in a company. All 4 of these concepts are fairly broad in the sense that they would capture potentially all sorts of industries. And then if you're engaging in these kinds of transactions, what does that mean? Next slide. I've briefly outlined here how the rule is set up. You have prohibited transactions relating to bulk data brokerage transactions, as well as human genomic data. So there's prohibited transactions, and then there's presumably less sensitive restricted transactions, which are employment agreements, investment agreements, and vendor agreements. Those will all be permissible if subject to certain mitigation guidelines that are not yet set forth under the rule, but will be prior to implementation of the rule, which you can see the effective date. We don't know of this rule because this is just an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. But it would, at the very earliest, have to be at the end of this year or early 2025. And again, just a reminder that these transactions that would be restricted or prohibited only are restricted and prohibited to the extent they involve bulk transactions of those kinds of agreements. Next slide. So just to finish up here, if you are looking at this rule, if you're a company, you're not sure whether this rule might have any impact, this is just a brief outline. You would want to look at, do you have the kind of data that's proposed for regulation? Do you have the kinds of covered transactions? All businesses have the kinds of covered transactions that are implicated there, but whether they're bulk data transactions is perhaps a separate matter depending on the kind of business and industry you're in. And then do you have transactions that involve or have the potential to involve the countries of concern? Obviously, notably there was China, which a lot of companies that have business with China would want to look at this to see how it might impact their regulations. And then to conclude, just some really open-ended questions that I think will have a huge impact in how broadly this rule will ultimately affect companies. What are the security measures? What does it mean if a transaction involves sensitive bulk data or involves U.S. government data? The ANPRM, DOJ doesn't really say at this point. There is a potential for licenses of transactions. I haven't talked about that, but it's sort of unclear under what circumstances such authorization would be given. And then another big one is just under what circumstances does a transaction take place? The proposed rule says that mere access is enough, which again could involve a lot of different business operations. So that concludes my section, and I'll turn it over to Ray.
All right. Thank you very much, Dave. Appreciate the insights. Ladies and gentlemen, so I'm ready to share some good news here about a data compliance practice, actually, related to China, especially from the international business perspective. So my name's Ray Liu. I'm the managing partner of Dorsey's Beijing office. I joined Dorsey in 2013 and actually opened the Beijing office for Dorsey in 2015. That's the year before the PRC cybersecurity law was enacted. So essentially, our Beijing office witnessed the entire process of China's data and privacy regime evolving from essentially nothing to a pretty much complex system right now. So I'm ready to walk you through the regime, sort of zooming out from the big picture perspective, and then focusing on the cross-border data transfer issue, especially the latest developments. So next slide, please. So here's the agenda. So we're here to, first of all, provide you guys with a high-level overview of the PRC data security and privacy protection law regime. And secondly, so we'll explain what the requirements are in terms of transferring data, particularly the personal information cross-border to overseas data recipients under the current rules and the prior rules. And thirdly, which is actually the focus of my presentation today, so we're going to talk in length about the regulations or provisions. So these are the translations that we use interchangeably on promoting and regulating cross-border data flow issued by Cybersecurity Administration of China, also known as CAC. And that new rule became effective on March 22nd, 2024, which is essentially less than a month ago. And essentially, what this new rules means has pretty profound and I would say encouraging impact on multinational companies, either doing business in China or doing business with Chinese parties. So it's a very relaxing set of rules, which is sort of unprecedented, especially compared with some of the pretty stringent laws and requirements that we have seen. So today we'll be focusing on the new rules. Next slide, please. All right, let's have an overview of the Chinese data protection law regime. So let's start with the big code, what we call PRC civil code. Well, bear in mind that China is a civil law country versus a common law jurisdiction. So the civil code is a very comprehensive legislation that codifies all the private laws of China. It has like 1,260 articles. It's very extensive legislation in the entire history of PRC, the most extensive one, actually. For the first time ever in PRC civil law, it introduces the provisions on the right of privacy and protection of personal information. So you can see that the privacy law has sort of already intertwined with the existing civil law system. And talking about the cybersecurity law or the personal information protection law, which are pretty well known to the audience here, I think China has a really right now robust system consisting of 3 pillars of the PRC data law, namely PRC cybersecurity law that became effective in 2017, in a data security law effective from 2021, personal information protection law effective from 2021, and PIPL, also known as PIPL, that law governs personal information processing activities carried out by entities or individuals within China. That law has also some extraterritorial reach. So together, these laws aim to protect both the security of the data infrastructure, public interest, as well as the privacy rights of individuals, placing various compliance requirements on companies operating in or dealing with data from China. Some of the requirements, as I mentioned, are pretty stringent. They're also supporting rules, implementation rules, guidelines issued by CAC or other regulatory bodies on cross-border transfer, data security, CIIO, critical information infrastructure operator. There are also rules on industry and local rules as well in provinces and cities. So right now we have a very robust and comprehensive system that we're dealing with. And CAC, Cyberspace Administration of China, is the main regulatory body at the central level and local level. Next slide, please. Talking about cross-border data transfer, so you have to look into Article 38 of PIPL. That essentially set forth 3 data transferring mechanism, which means if you need to transfer personal information outside of territory of China due to business or other needs, you have to meet one of the conditions, right? You either have to pass a security assessment conducted by CAC, that's the most stringent one, or you have to get certified by a specialized agency for protection of personal information in accordance with the provisions of the CAC, or you enter into a contract with the overseas recipient, and that contract was formulated by CAC, and of course, some of the clauses are now allowed to change. And actually, there's a 4th catch-all version which says if you can meet other requirements or conditions prescribed by laws and administrative regulations of the CAC. Actually, this new rule that I'm going to talk about fall into the catch-all categories, meaning you don't need to go through one of the 3 transferring mechanism. It is prescribed by law. These are allowed as exemptions. Next slide. So the regulations or provisions on promoting or regulating the cross-border data flow is actually, I would say, a very anticipated new rules, widely welcomed and even celebrated by market players. Because as you can imagine, when you have a very low threshold for sorting out and complying with one of the 3 pretty harsh or sometimes difficult transferring mechanism, so it's pretty burdensome for companies to comply with. And actually, CAC recently, prior to the announcement of new rule, got swamped by various filings and assessments requests. So this rule is absolutely a game changer. So it introduces substantial changes to the current rules over cross-border data transfer, including exemptions from filing the standard contract, applying for certifications, or conducting a security assessment, or it actually introduced higher thresholds for these three transferring mechanisms, make things easier for the market players or the data processor. Next slide, please. So let's look at the eased requirements here. First of all, the heightened thresholds. We don't have time to go through each one of the changes, but you can see the previous thresholds, someone argue, are very stringent, even draconian. The new thresholds under the regulations or provisions are more manageable or feasible. Just give you one example, right? Suppose you are an internet company, right? You process personal information of 1 million people, right? Even if you only transfer personal information of one individual cross-border, outbound, you have to go through the security assessment, which takes weeks or even months, right? But look at the new threshold accordingly. So the rule has significantly changed to that when you actually transfer personal information of more than 1 million individuals cross-border within the same year, not the previous year, within the same year, and then you will have to go through the security assessment and get it done. So that's much easier compliance requirements and much heightened thresholds. So that will save a lot of companies, including even some tech companies, from the hassle of going through the security assessment. And of course, there are also exemptions, and there are also heightened thresholds for filing the standard contract and obtaining a certification as well. Next slide, please. So the next two slides, I will talk about in total 6 exemptions as prescribed by the new regulation and rules. Remember, as I mentioned, so all of these 6 rules will be essentially put in the basket of the category 4 of the Article 38 of PIPL, which means they are conditions prescribed by laws or rules by CAC. So which means you don't need to go through one of the 3 transferring mechanism. You're just fine, right? The first one is what we call small scale transfer. So if you're transferring personal information of less than 100,000 individuals to overseas recipients within the current year, you don't need to do one of the 3 mandated requirements. But so long as there's no important data, no sensitive information, if you're not a CIO, that is fine. The second category is necessary for contracts, right? For the outbound transfer of personal information of individuals necessary for performing contracts to which such individuals are parties, right? So what are these contracts? Pretty basic and daily, right? Including cross-border shopping, online shopping, mailing, delivery, courier, remittance, payment, account opening, flight and hotel reservation, visa processing, examination services. So these will make a lot of business life easier for sure. And thirdly, necessary for HR management as the third exemption here. This is huge because, as you can imagine, a lot of companies, they're sort of stuck. They were stuck between a hard and rock place previously because they had to choose, do we need to do some fundamental changes to our global HR practices, or do we need to stick to it, risking violating PRC law? If the outbound transfer of the employee's personal information necessary for implementation of cross-border human resource management in accordance with the labor rules and regulation developed or collective contracts executed in accordance with the rule, that is exempted, which means you could possibly safely transfer personal information of the employees cross-border, outbound from China, which is exempted. But of course, you still have to comply with the other requirements under PIPL, especially the principle of minimum and necessary, which is mandated by PIPL. And next slide, please. emergency situation, which is pretty self-explanatory. I will not further elaborate. And the next one is very interesting. No personal information or no important data. Because if you're doing international trade or cross-border transportation or academic issue or transnational manufacturing process or marketing activities, if the data do not fall within the scope of personal information, are they allowed to freely transfer? The answer is yes. Now, the rule makes it crystal clear. So long as these are not important data, but important data is, is well-defined definition. It has to have some implications with national security or public interest, and the rules make it clear that the government has to name it, right? The government has to, CAC has to announce it that it is important data. Otherwise, you don't need to worry about your data if it's not defined by the government or announced by the government. So the last category is PI, personal information collected and generated outside of China. If the information were collected outside of China, they were sent to China for processing and then sent it outbound again. So long as it does not involve personal information of PRC individuals or important data, you're fine. These can freely transfer. Next slide. Probably we don't have time to go through the new procedures, but you can see the valid period got prolonged. It's relatively easier and more feasible to apply for extension. We have a simplified procedure for security assessment and standard contract. Next slide, please. Free trade zone. China has 21 free trade zones, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, you name it. So all the free trade zones have the authority to create their own list of data to require security assessment, standard contract, etc. So this is so-called negative list. So long as it's not on the list, it is exempted in this particular free trade zone. So free trade zone actually encouraged more business being set up in those zones. Next slide, please. So what remains unchanged? We'll probably do not have time to go through each one of them, but we'll have to say we'll have to comply with PIPL regardless of the new rules taking effective. You still have to send out the informed consent, obtain the separate consent from the data subject, have to do the PIPIA report, etc. And you still have to make sure that there's no sensitive personal information because there's no significant relaxation for cross-border transfer of such. And we don't have time to explain what the sensitive personal information, but you guessed it, the concept similar: biometrics, religious beliefs, specific identities, information of minors under age 14, for example. Next slide, please. So what's next? Just to wrap up, the regulations are intended to ease the burden of compliance requirements for cross-border transfer and to stimulate economic growth and attract foreign investments, to make life easier for both international companies as well as domestic companies going abroad. In light of these new changes and the ever evolving and ever complexing legal regime in China, we recommend that the companies in the market conduct data mapping, implement data tracking mechanism to effectively monitor and assess the volume of personal information and important data, if any, transfer out of China. So we have to keep track of the changes and promptly update our policies and adjust data management to ensure compliance and mitigate risks. So with that, I will turn it over to my partner, Ron Moscona, in London to talk about the exciting Artificial Intelligence Act in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. So we're going to jump into something completely different now. As many of you might have heard, the EU introduced a fairly comprehensive regulatory legislation in relation to artificial intelligence, and I will talk about that. My name is Ron Moscona. I'm a partner at the London office of Dorsey & Whitney, specializing in all aspects of technology, intellectual property, data privacy and regulatory issues. So we heard two, in our international panel, which is where we're at the moment, we had two presentations that focus very much on data transfers, and this has a lot to do not just with privacy but also with geopolitical relationships and trade. So it's a combination of both privacy concerns and real trade issues and competition in the international market between two major players, mainly the US and China, but also across other countries. And of course, the EU had its own a fair amount of restrictions on international transfer of data that tends to focus quite a lot on privacy concerns. What we're talking about now is something completely different. And it's important to mention that because in the context of AI, there's also a lot of export control type trade war issues. And of course, there are a lot of restrictions being imposed today by countries in Europe and the US on the exports of high-end semiconductor devices that are necessary to process AI and all of that. And this is an important issue, but this is not what we're talking about today, because what we're talking about today is the European Union AI Act, which is an attempt to introduce a fairly comprehensive regulatory framework to deal with the risks that the artificial intelligence technology poses to consumers, to people, to society. So this is very much along the line of regulatory framework for pharmaceuticals, for electric devices, for automotives and things like that. This is the context in which we're dealing with here. Having said that, as you will see when we go a little bit into the details, a lot of it is actually focused on privacy issues. So a lot of the concerns that the EU seems to be alerted to in the context of AI are to do with privacy concerns. So let's jump onto the next slide, please. So this will try to give an impression about what this AI legislation is all about. And I think the first thing anyone want to know is, why is that important? Why is that important to me? And the answer is fairly simple. This is a regulatory framework that, if you find yourself within it, there's a fairly involved compliance requirement, and it depends on what you do and what the product is. But if you are regulated, this is this is a regulatory framework for introducing a product onto the market, and that applies to anyone who introduces a regulated product, if you like, or a product that comes within the scope of the legislation into the market in the EU. So it doesn't matter if you're a Chinese company or a Russian company. Well, we don't deal much with Russian companies these days. A Canadian company or an American company or a Brazilian one. It's the question whether you are placing a product on the market in the EU, and that's when a product or a service, and that's when you might come into the within this regulation. And so the main question is really, what is covered by this regulation? Am I within it, or am I not within it? And this slide perhaps will help me to give you an idea about the scope of this regulation. So there are, if you like, 4 elements, as you can see, in this regulation. There's the element about prohibited AI systems. Even though it takes half of this slide, it's actually a tiny part of the legislation. And the only really important thing here is the first indent that you see here. AI systems that are designed for fraud are prohibited. That doesn't really add a lot to the law, because fraud is covered by other laws, and it's so the law says that AI systems, essentially AI systems designed for fraud, are unlawful. Other things are to do with privacy issues. I'm not going to go into details, but some of these issues are already also covered by existing data protection laws, GDPR. So, for example, biometric systems designed to deduce sensitive categories of categorization of individuals are banned. But that is not really surprising, because GDPR already says that any processing of these sensitive or special categories of the same ones that Ray mentioned, like religious beliefs, political alignment, and all these kind of sensitive issues, that you can only process them usually only with the consent of the data subject. So of course, if you have an AI system that is designed to deduce these things without your consent, then it's already prohibited under GDPR. So the prohibited list is short, it's narrow, it's not that interesting, and there's nothing particularly surprising about anything there. Then there's the category of rules that apply to all AI systems. And these rules are actually very limited. Their transparency is very important, and it's a useful thing that the EU introduced. These are the transparency obligations for all AI systems. Really, I mean, and putting things in context, this regulation is not necessarily about generative AI. It's not necessarily about ChatGPT. This is about every AI. So it's the AI that operates the self-driving cars. That is the AI that operates your legal research database kind of system. It's the AI that operates a medical device. So it's a lot of, it deals with a lot of AI which is used in industry, in practical things like flying planes or driving cars or things like that. So the transparency obligation, although it applies to all AI systems, I think that is very important, because this is the one bit of this regulation that deals with the use of AI in social media, in general media, in communications, because that's where it really is relevant. There are two requirements that apply to all AI systems that are put on the market in the EU. One is that when an AI system interacts with a human, that needs to be disclosed. So the human needs to know that. So if you're ringing up your service organization and you get a reply, and that reply is AI, so they have to, I guess, introduce themselves. I'm your AI help desk, and that will be the reality of our lives, if not next year, then in 3 years' time, right? So when you interact with AI, you have to know about it. And the second thing, content which is AI generate needs to be labeled as such. So this is the rule. I think, like all rules, if you start digging under the headline, you can scratch your head and wonder how it's going to be implemented in practice, but that is the nature of the law. But so the principle is that labeling AI content and disclosing when you are dealing with AI, which is nice, and that applies to everyone, and that's useful to know if you are introducing a interactive AI system into the market. And then you have the heart of the law. The heart of this legislation is about a regulatory framework, as I say, a full-blown regulatory compliance framework for high-risk AI models. And I will talk a little bit about high-risk AI models, not in great detail, but a little bit. There are two types of them. One, AI models that form part of regulated products like aircraft and cars and things like that, and other AI models which come under specific sectors that the EU legislation has identified as high risk. If you are within those, then you have a significant compliance burden going forward. And lastly, the legislation deals with general purpose AI model. General purpose, there are lots of course, this is a new technology and it's moving a lot. And the idea of general purpose AI models, I don't think it's identical to saying that it's the same as generative AI. There is obviously a certain overlap. General purpose is basically defined in this legislation as AI models that are not specific to any particular user case. They're not designed for any particular implementation. They can be used by other companies or by other providers for all sorts of purposes. So the generative AI models, the large language models, at least, they're an example perhaps of a general purpose AI model. They're not necessarily the only ones. There could be other fundamental AI models that can still come under this category without being necessarily generative. So the general purpose AI models, they have certain requirements applying to them, even though it's not a full-blown regulatory burden. So very quickly, we'll jump to the next slide, please. You can see the types of regulated products where the AI would also be regulated within those products. There's nothing special about it because these are regulated products anyway. So if you are making a medical device which includes or is an AI model, then it would be regulated as a medical device in the EU. And this legislation adds a little bit more detail about how the AI elements within it should be regulated. But it does, I mean, you were regulated before this legislation, and you continue to be regulated after this legislation. So it's not adding a huge amount of information. Next slide, please. Here we can see the perhaps the most significant addition that this legislation introduces, which is defining. These are 5 of 8. The next slide lists another 3 sectors within which certain user cases are defined by the legislation as high risk. Now, this is important because if you are within the particular user cases that are listed within those 8 sectors, then your product or your model is deemed to be high risk, and then it's subject to full-blown regulation, just like manufacture of pharmaceuticals or medical devices or cars or aircraft. So you can see the type of things, and I emphasize, it's not everything to do with education or everything to do with employment. It's certain user cases within those situations. So in relation to education, admission, assessments, things like that. Employment is about recruitment, promotion, things like that. AI systems that are within those user cases are treated as AI and subject to serious regulation. Next slide, please. Here you have a few others. These include the law enforcement, administration of justice. So these kind of things, if you are within those user cases, you become regulated. Next slide, please. The emphasis here is that there's a lot of things that fall outside the scope of this regulation. And you can have a look at this slide later, and it's quite interesting. One example I would give, you could be using AI in healthcare. If it's not a medical device, it's not considered high risk. So there's huge elements of use of AI in really important areas that could be actually quite sensitive that fall outside of this regulation. So other than the general transparency requirements, for example, if it's not a regulated device, you could use AI in connection with pharmaceuticals, in connection with clinical trials, in connection with development of pharmaceuticals. This is not considered high risk. It's not regulated under this legislation. There's tons of other things like banking. If it's not access to banking, it's not regulated. Next slide, please. These are the kind of compliance issues that you'd have to deal with. They're full-blown compliance requirements, including engagement with regulators, transparency, a lot of good, important stuff. It is significant if you're within it. And then next slide, please. Lastly, we have the regulation of general purpose AI models. The legislation says very little about it. It's not insignificant because you have very significant requirements for maintaining technical documentation, which must be available to regulators if they want it. You have to provide disclosure to the people who license the general purpose AI model from you so they can comply with their requirements. You have to comply with copyright policy. You have to publish information as to how you trained your data and where you got and that reflects some of the issues that are now in litigation, as Jamie mentioned earlier. So there are significant issues here, but all of these issues are captured in 2 pages of legislation. There's not a lot of detail there. Like everything in this legislation, but particularly in connection with the general purpose AI models, it all depends on how regulators would actually develop this and what they will make of this, because there will have to be a database of general purpose AI models with systemic risk, and regulators will then need to decide what they do with that database and what they do with the technical documentation that is presented to them, and what they do with the requirements to evaluate, assess, and mitigate risks. These are very, very general requirements, and you can make whatever you want from them. So if the EU is going to put a lot of professional regulators into implementing this, then this is going to be a serious regulatory compliance program. At the moment, it's just very, very general language in a piece of legislation. So that is where we are. I came to the end of this. It's very bold on the one hand, but it's quite premature on the other hand, because it's a bit of a patchwork. It kind of like says a few obvious things, like regulated products will be regulated, and it identifies very specific sectors in which it says products will be treated high risk. But then there's vast areas of trade where the legislation doesn't go into, and it would require new legislation to cover them. There's a lot of new stuff there, but it leaves a lot of issues uncovered as well. So with this, I will wrap up and allow Jeanette to come and talk about wire fraud and how Hong Kong practitioners can help with that.
Thank you so much, Ron. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's session. I'm Janet Wong, a partner and head of Hong Kong office, specializing in intellectual property, cross-border financial disputes, and asset discovery. Just now, our fellow speakers, Dave, Ray, and Ron, have shared their expert insights on the latest legal development of data transfer of an AI in the United States, mainland China, and Europe. Next, I will be switching to an equally important topic, cybersecurity, with an emphasis on the AI elements. I'll be discussing the critical issues surrounding the international wire fraud. Next slide, please. So I will provide a brief overview of wire fraud, providing some statistics from the United States and Hong Kong, and then talk about why Hong Kong is an attractive destination for wire fraud, the current wire fraud trends, including the one relating to AI, and the current legal development in Hong Kong, as well as some practical tips to prevent wire fraud. Next slide, please. So what is wire fraud? It is a type of fraud that involves the use of electronic communications to execute certain fraudulent schemes that deceive individuals or entities into sending money electronically. So according to the FBI's latest Internet Crime Report, in 2023 alone, the United States witnessed over 880,000 complaints, with potential losses exceeding $12.5 billion. Similarly, in 2023, Hong Kong reported more than 39,000 deception cases, resulting in losses surpassing 9 billion Hong Kong dollar, which is approximately $1.15 billion. And among them, 70% of these cases are internet related scams, such as online shopping, investment scam, employment scam, social media scam, and telephone deception cases. So these staggering figures not only reveal the extensive reach of wire fraud, but also highlight the urgent need for robust and proactive strategy to effectively combat this criminal activity. Next slide, please. So why Hong Kong is an attractive destination for wire fraud? Hong Kong, as a global financial center, possesses several attributes that unfortunately make it a prime target for wire fraud. So first of all, it is a sophisticated yet open banking system that facilitates swift international transaction that provides a perfect setting for quick fund movements. Also, secondly, Hong Kong is strategically located close to the major Asian economies, serving as a primary gateway to mainland China, making it uniquely positioned in global finance. Also, while Hong Kong has advanced digital infrastructure that promotes efficiency and connectivity, it also introduces significant vulnerability to cyber attacks. Next slide, please. So in the next two slides, I have set out the different key types of cyber fraud and emerging trends for your reference. As technology evolves, cyber attacks have becoming more sophisticated and new types of wire fraud have emerged. I'm not going to explain these types of fraud in detail at the moment. Instead, I would like to focus on one of the emerging trends associated with the rise of AI. The use of AI to create deepfakes present new challenges, as this technology can be employed to facilitate more complex scams. Next slide, please. So this three table shows the type of wire fraud throughout the years. From 10 years ago, about very popular CEO scams, business compromise scams, and now during the COVID time, we have a COVID-related scam, and during the past few years, the rise of cryptocurrency and NFT scam. So nowadays, with the rise of AI, it also create a new type of scam, the deepfake scam. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I would like to talk about a very recent, significant, and sophisticated wire fraud case in Hong Kong. Just 2 months ago, in February, a finance worker at the Hong Kong office of a multinational corporation was deceived into transferring 200 million Hong Kong dollar, which is approximately 25.6 million US dollar, through 15 transactions to multiple bank accounts. The worker believed that he was actually following the instructions from the company's CFO, but in fact, it was not the case. There was actually a bunch of fraudsters employed deepfake technology to mimic the appearance and voices of the CEO and also other staff members of the company during a fabricated video conference call. So although initially the finance worker was suspicious because of a questionable email, but after attending this fixed fabricated conference call, seeing the faces and voice of the CEO and other staff member of the company, the worker was eventually convinced by these realistic deepfakes and proceeded with all these 15 transactions. So this incident marks the first known case in Hong Kong where victims were deceived in a multi-person video conference setting. These cases also highlight the increasing use of advanced technology in financial crimes. Next slide, please. So I now turn our focus to various legal mechanisms available in Hong Kong for freezing and tracing assets. Currently, Hong Kong Police and the Court of Hong Kong have the power to freeze bank accounts within the territories. The Hong Kong Police can issue the letter of no consent, or what we call LNC, which serve as an informal mechanism to freeze bank account suspected of containing proceeds from fraud. However, this mechanism is temporary. Typically, an LNC is valid for up to 6 months and is subject to regular review. So in 2021, the Hong Kong Court of First Instance declared the LNC the letters of no consent issued by the Hong Kong Police ultra vires, which is not legal, not constitutional. 2 years later, in 2023, the Court of Appeal reinstated the constitutionality of the LNC. And just last week, the Court of Final Appeal handed down a decision in this case, affirming the legality of the police operation involving the letter of no consent to prevent the dissipations of funds in criminal investigation. So this finally marks the end of the challenge to the legality of the LNC, which is now still constitutional. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the LNC issued by the Hong Kong police is a temporary one. And oftentimes it is very uncertain as to whether and how quick the Hong Kong police is going to issue the LNC. Therefore, it is always advisable, especially if substantial amount of funds is involved, to obtain a formal court injunction from the Hong Kong court to freeze the bank account. The two main types of injunction that we usually sought on behalf of the plaintiff are the Moreover injunction and the proprietary injunction. In the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss these two types of injunction in detail, which you can refer to the slides for more information. So in brief, each type of injunction has their specific threshold and requirement. Depending on the circumstances, we may apply for both injunctions to maximize the likelihood of recovery of the assets. Next slide, please. So to trace and recover assets, plaintiff can also apply to the court for a banker's discovery order under Section 21 of the Evidence Ordinance in Hong Kong. So this order permits the plaintiff to inspect and take copies of any entries in a banker's record, which can help identifying the defendant, their identity, and also can help identify and recover the assets involved in the fraud. Next, please. So dealing with wire fraud presents various challenges. One of the challenges that we often encounter is the service of court documents outside of jurisdiction. Traditionally, scammers would use Hong Kong companies to receive funds. More recently, there has been a shift towards using individuals from mainland China or other foreign locations to set up these accounts. And these accounts often lack genuine addresses. Having said that, the Hong Kong judiciary is increasingly opened to grant order of substituted service and to allow using modern communication methods to effect service of court document, such as in a case that involve allowing the plaintiff to serve the defendants using email or text messages, or even sending to their Facebook account or by WeChat. So in a case that I handled very recently, the court recognized the difficulties in reaching elusive defendants across border. And also we've got an order allowing service via email and SMS based on the contact information provided from the provided on the bank documents. So this flexibility is very important for effective and swift asset recovery in the face of international challenges. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide of my presentation, where I have outlined some practical tips to help prevent wire fraud. So basically, stay informed. Keep up with the latest wire fraud trends, such as the wire fraud tactics like deepfakes the fraudster are using, as we discussed earlier, and implement robust security measure, such as the very popular two-factor authentication, and also regularly train employees to recognize the sign of fraud. As technology advances, so also consider using advanced technology or some AI tools to enhance fraud detection. Also, we need to verify the sources meticulously, very cautious with unexpected requests for sensitive information or financial transactions. Always confirm the authenticity of such requests by contacting the sender through verified means. As I said, with the increasing use of deepfakes, try to verify with the person in person whenever possible. Maybe we can use some prearranged secret codes among the team members to confirm the identities, ensuring secure and reliable verification. So lastly, if fraud is suspected, act very quickly, because oftentimes time is of the essence in this situation. Immediately contact your bank to stop the transaction and recall the funds as soon as possible. Also, report the incidents to your local enforcement authorities. In the case of the US, contact FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, the IC3. And if the funds have been transferred to Hong Kong, report the case online through the Hong Kong Police online portal, the e-report center. Extra tips, make sure you save copies of all these police reports, obtain the contact details of all your police officers that have been handling the case, and get the case file number in all these jurisdictions. Getting all these details are very important and can assist in following up with these enforcement authorities. And of course, engage a trusted lawyer with the expertise who can help you navigate the legal systems and help with liaising with the banks and authorities, enforcement authorities in a timely manner, which is very important as time is of the essence. So in conclusion, awareness, preparedness, and swift actions are your best defense against wire fraud. So always stay informed, stay secure, and act fast when you suspect fraud. So thank you all for your attention and engagement during the sessions. And I hope this insight empower you to better protect yourself and your organization against wire fraud. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our international panels. Very helpful and interesting, and so many things you covered. So I've put a slide here that talks about your returning your completed sign-in. We will also have that at the end. Feel free to contact any of these speakers if you have questions about their materials. And we have some information here about how you can get the materials. So I would like to introduce our speakers for this fourth panel. We have Dustin Berger, who's an associate in our Denver office, and one of our security experts. Dustin has a CISSP certification, which if you're a security person, you know not many lawyers have. Jennifer Coates, who's a litigation partner and handles a lot of incident response. Deborah Howitt, who's a partner in our Denver office and handles a broad range of privacy and cybersecurity matters. And Jessica Liano, who's a litigator in our Southern California office, handling privacy-related litigation in California. I will turn it over to this panel. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jamie. So I'm Deb Howard in the Denver office, as Jamie mentioned. So thank you all for being here today. In this panel, we will give you an overview of some of the recent trends in privacy litigation, including some recent litigation under some newer theories involving some pretty old statutes we'll discuss. And then we will also cover data breach trends and cybersecurity measures designed to prevent data breaches. So first, I'd like to mention that in recent years, we've seen plaintiffs' attorneys bringing privacy litigation claims under some statutes that were first enacted long before the internet existed. Some of their arguments are pretty creative, I have to admit, but the proliferation of these cases has resulted in a tidal wave of litigation against companies who are not, in fact, violating any of the current privacy laws that were just discussed in our earlier panels, such as the CCPA or these other state laws. Instead, they are bringing up some very old statutes and interpreting some of the requirements of the statutes in new ways. Many of the claims faced by companies are now arising simply because they use the metapixel on their site, which is really broad common practice for just about any company engaged in any consumer-facing marketing these days. And it's been in use for almost 2 decades now. So it's certainly not something anybody would consider to be, an outrageous practice or, offensive or any of the types of claims that previously had to be proven under privacy tort litigation in the past. In case you're not aware, the metapixel is just a small piece of code that companies can place on their websites in order to receive insights into how the site's audience interacts with their ads on Meta's social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram, how those users behave on the company's own website after they click on an ad. It helps to track ad conversions and just optimizing advertising and marketing practices in very common and widespread ways across consumer-facing websites. So these latest cases are really just about the numbers. They're being filed under laws that have statutory damages per violation. And I think that's what the plaintiffs' attorneys are focused on. So they're filing as many suits as possible, even if there's really sort of no tangible harm to individuals. And even when it's not truly clear if the statute is applicable to the circumstances, just knowing that many of the defendants will settle and different courts have different interpretations and opinions on, what is relevant and what is actually covered under the law and what should be dismissed. So there's a lot going on in this area, but many of them are surviving motions to dismiss, and it's resulting in hundreds of cases being filed. One of these older laws for which litigation has recently increased is the Federal Video Privacy Protection Act, the VPPA. So this law was enacted back in 1988 following the Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Robert Bork, in which his video rental history was disclosed. So this law was designed for companies such as Blockbuster back in the day to prevent those companies from disclosing a customer's video rental history without prior express written consent. The VPPA was more recently amended to make it clear that it does apply in online video content delivery, but these cases are really stretching a lot of these definitions. So Jessica, I know you've been working on quite a few of these cases. Can you please provide an overview of what types of companies can be held liable under the VPPA?
Yes, happy to. Thank you, Deb. So to repeat what Deb said, the VPPA imposes liability on a videotape service provider who knowingly discloses to any person personally identifiable information concerning any consumer of such provider. And as Deb mentioned, plaintiffs are now seeking to expand the VPPA to new technology. And recent cases have turned on several elements of the statute, but usually one, the videotape service provider element and the consumer element. Now, as to the first, who is a videotape service provider or what company can be found a videotape service provider, the VPPA defines a videotape service provider as any person engaged in the business in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce of rental, sale, or delivery of pre-recorded video cassette tapes or similar audiovisual materials. And given that we are not frequently watching content on a pre-recorded video cassette tape, whether a company is engaged in the business of providing similar audiovisual materials is often the key. So, as Deb mentioned, when you hear the term videotape service provider, you might think of a Blockbuster or something like a Redbox where you're buying or renting a videotape or DVD. But we're seeing plaintiffs bring VPPA claims against a wide range of companies, whether they sell a food product, clothing, really running the gamut of products and companies, as long as the company is offering promotional video content on their websites. And this theory we're seeing most often alleged is that by using an analytics tool like the metapixel, the company is violating the VPPA. Specifically, plaintiffs are alleging that when a user is logged into their Facebook account and they watch a video, even if it's a promotional video on a company's website, the metapixel is transmitting information about the person watching the video and the video they watched to Facebook. And plaintiffs are arguing that this practice violates the VPPA's prohibition on disclosing consumers' video watching history. And so going, next slide, please. So in looking at which type of companies can be liable under the VPPA and what it means to be a videotape service provider, courts are looking at what it means to be engaged in the business specifically. So to be engaged in the business of delivering video content, the defendant's product must not only be substantially involved in the conveyance of video content to consumers, but also significantly tailored to serve that purpose. And we're seeing the last phrase, which is the significantly tailored to serve that purpose phrase, be key in a lot of these cases. So in one case involving modern technology, which is Patreon, the website where you can subscribe or pay to access content creators' videos, podcasts, other media, the court denied Patreon's motion to dismiss. The court found that allegations that customers were paying Patreon to access content creators' videos was sufficient to allege that Patreon was engaged in the business of delivering video content. And the court found that to be the case, even if Patreon wasn't the one making the content. On the other hand, courts have also held that using videos for marketing or increasing brand awareness is not enough to be engaged in the business of providing video content. So I provide here a few examples of recent cases where courts found that the defendant was not engaged in the business and could not be liable under the VPPA. So in one of these cases, Hernandez versus Justin's Inc., this was actually a case litigated by one of my colleagues and I. The court held that it was not plausible to allege that defendant was engaged in the business of delivering video content simply by including pre-recorded videos on its website that market the products that defendant does sell. And for Justin's, that would be selling school memorabilia or class rings. That was far different, the court found, than a company like Patreon, who makes money or their business models based off selling video content. The court found the same thing in Cantu versus Tapestry Inc., which was a case against Tapestry, which is the brand Coach. So advertising via videos, its purses, scarves, other accessories was not enough to make Coach a videotape service provider under the VPPA. And the court found the same thing in a case against Chick-fil-A, rejecting the allegations that Chick-fil-A having some video content on its websites to promote its food was enough to bring it within the scope of the VPPA. So Deb, we're seeing courts really focus on, one, what is the business doing? What is the company's focus? Is their business model focused on selling video content? Or is the video content really incidental to the goods or services that they really do sell and focus on selling?
Thank you so much, Jessica. That's very helpful regarding the companies who can be sued under this statute. But what about the potential claimants, the consumers who have viewed the videos? Are they also looking to expand the definition of who could bring a claim under the VPPA in these cases?
Yes, Deb. So plaintiffs are certainly trying to expand the definition, and courts have helpfully been narrowing the definition for some of the companies. If you don't mind moving to the next slide, Jamie. The VPPA provides another helpful definition, which is the definition of a consumer. So the VPPA defines a consumer as any renter, purchaser, or subscriber of goods or services from a videotape service provider. And courts have clarified that the plaintiff must be a consumer or subscriber of the defendant's video content. And buying something from the defendant other than video content is not enough. So the VPPA provides for an action by a renter, purchaser, or subscriber of audiovisual materials. And courts have taken that to mean this is literally purchasing audiovisual materials. It's not meant to apply to a broader category of consumers who may buy some product that has nothing to do with videos or anything else audiovisual. And we saw the court make this conclusion in ruling on a motion to dismiss in a recent case against the Container Store, which is in the Central District of California. So just a few months ago, the district court granted a motion to dismiss brought by the Container Store. And in this case, the plaintiff brought a fairly creative theory, arguing that they had gone to the Container Store, bought some type of container product, and therefore they were a consumer for purposes of a VPPA claim because they bought something from the defendant. And the court provided some clarification that this is not what the statute was intended to regulate. So even in cases where the court has found the defendant may be a videotape service provider, VPPA claims have still been dismissed for failure to allege a consumer or subscriber element. If you can go to the next slide, please, Jamie. So these cases are often turning on promotional video content, as we've discussed, embedded videos advertising a product or showcasing the defendant's goods or services. We don't usually have plaintiffs arguing a typical consumer relationship in the sense that it's a consumer paying for something, they get something back. So the statute does mention that a consumer can also be a subscriber. But even in the day of new technology and access to lots of video content, courts have still put some parameters on what it means to be a subscriber under the VPPA. And courts have held in several cases that subscribing to a free newsletter is not enough. And this is the type of newsletter we often see. Once you make a purchase from a website, you'll start getting emails about, buy this product, here's a sale. So we've seen cases, including this first case, Carter versus Scripps, where plaintiffs have alleged that they subscribed to a free newsletter from the defendant, and because they subscribed to that newsletter, they are now a subscriber for purposes of the VPPA. So in this first case, Carter, plaintiffs watched free video content from HGTV on hgtv.com, and then brought VPPA claims against HGTV, arguing that they were a subscriber because they signed up for a promotional newsletter from HGTV. And here the court provided a helpful definition of what subscriber means for the VPPA. Free newsletters may entice or encourage recipients to view the defendant's videos, but plaintiffs didn't assert that a newsletter was required to access those videos, was required to log in and view the videos, or gave the subscribers any extra benefits as viewers. This is in contrast to a case like Patreon, where paying and making a login gets you access to video content that someone who doesn't have a login or doesn't have a subscription relationship, they don't have those same benefits. And we've also seen some clever theories where plaintiffs are alleging that they've downloaded the defendant's app. So this could be an app that you use in the store to scan products or to look at what's being sold, whatever is promotional. And courts have held that downloading a free app is not necessarily enough either to be a subscriber. In one case, against Cartoon Network, which did involve some video content, the court still held that there was no subscription relationship, and there was thus no VPPA claim. The court in Cartoon Network held that a person who downloads and uses a free mobile application on their smartphone to view freely available content without more is not a subscriber. Now, this is an example of where the courts are applying factors to determine whether someone is a subscriber. Payment can be a factor, but it's not required. And courts are also looking at things like the level of commitment. Are you required to make a login? And in order to view content on the app, you have to log in. Or is it simply one can open the app and they view free videos? So in contrast, in another case against a media provider, Gannett, the plaintiff did allege sufficiently that he was a subscriber of the defendant's video content for VPPA purposes, even though the content was free, because the content on the app could only be accessed after the user provided personal information to defendant, such as their Android ID and their GPS location. So there are several factors that will turn on the subscriber or consumer relationship, but Deb, we're seeing courts still put some parameters on who can be a plaintiff and who is a defendant for a VPPA claim.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Another even older statute we've seen being resurrected for litigation recently is the Federal Wiretap Act and some analogous claims under similar state wiretap laws. So Jennifer, can you please give us a brief overview of those statutes and what they were designed to achieve originally? And can we move to the next slide, please? Jennifer, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Jessica, do you want to jump in?
Can you hear me
and do
now?
this? Oh, yes, we can hear you now. Okay, thanks.
Sure. So the federal wiretap statutes were designed in 1986 in order basically to avoid people intercepting information from rotary dial phones. Now, I don't know about you, but if you look in my house and you show my children a rotary phone, they actually don't even know what it is. And so when you think about how old the technology is that it was originally designed to address, it's hard to imagine how it's also now being used with privacy litigation. As a trial lawyer and as a litigator, I can tell you that, if you look throughout U.S., the United States' case law, its history, U.S. is often trying to relate back to one of its principles so that it's not necessarily recreating the wheel every single time. And the reason for that really has to do with government just in law is just not going to move as fast as technology and as fast as private industry. And so when you see the government or courts relating back to wiretap or VPPA or even plaintiffs' attorneys, what they're doing is they're trying to not make the court recreate the wheel. Now, plaintiffs' attorneys are incredibly smart. I don't know that people always give them credit for being as smart as they are. And one of the things that they're very good at is understanding that history, that jurisprudence, and how the United States court system relates back to its earlier, I guess, for lack of better world foundation and form. So when you're looking at the Wiretap Act, which is essentially designed to not intercept somebody else's communication, and it has to be done with intent. Intent is defined very specifically as it can't just be an accident. The company doing it actually has to intend for something like this to occur. The communication itself is defined, as well as content is defined as the real substance of what is intended to be communicated. So there are fairly specific definitions here that are actually going to help courts, I guess, put some parameters around these types of lawsuits. What you're essentially seeing with wiretap are really two separate types of theories on the case. One is essentially chatbots. So chatbots, for those of you who don't know, if you're on a website late at night, you might see somebody say to you, hey, can I help you? Can I help you? And it'll just sort of flash for you. And you think to yourself, who possibly could be up at 2 o'clock in the morning and willing to answer all of my questions? Well, the answer is nobody is up at 2 o'clock in the morning willing to answer your questions. What's really happening is you are engaging with the chatbot. And essentially, the theory of the case is that the chatbot is encouraging people to provide information about themselves, private information that's protected, or information that talks about how, in fact, they engage with the website. And that is considered to be information that should be protected, at least according to plaintiffs' counsel and plaintiffs' attorneys. Thus far, it has not been completely successful, but it has been somewhat successful in that it depends on the kind of information that the individual is supposedly providing to the chat bot. One industry that's having a really difficult time right now is the healthcare industry. And that leads into both chatbot information as well as session replay information. In fact, there was just a case filed yesterday, about 18 hours ago, it was reported down here or down in North Carolina. And so when you're thinking about chatbots and those other types of platform operators, a couple of things. One, is it being run in-house? Almost never is it being run in-house. It's almost obviously a contracted out third-party vendor. So then the question is, is that third-party vendor a part of the conversation? And if that third-party vendor is a part of the conversation, what type of information are they being given, and what type of information are they collecting? More significantly, what information have they been instructed to collect? Essentially, what that will come down to, and what that will instruct courts and litigation strategy regarding, is how much is this, how liable is that third party versus the liability of the main or the person that has contracted for this service. The other place that we're seeing a lot of wiretap litigation is in session replays. So session replays, and this is also something that healthcare industries and hospitals are having some difficulty with, but session replays essentially give somebody an opportunity to say, this is how this person came into the website and this is where they went. So I know years and years and years ago, there was a Target story about a man who called Target very upset and angry because Target had sent his teenage daughter some coupons for prenatal stuff. And he called Target and said, my daughter's 15 or 16, however old she was, and she's not pregnant. How dare you send her these coupons for baby stuff? Well, it turned out his daughter was in fact pregnant. And Target had figured that out based on tracking how she went through the store and how she had picked up products, what she had picked up, and how she had purchased them. And it was tracking that type of data. So if you think about, on the other side, now somebody on a website, for instance, in a hospital or a medical facility, and thinking about, okay, I'm going to go check for colon cancer today, or I'm going to go check for breast cancer or whatnot, and that information being collected and the person going through, the website, that being collected, and then somebody coming back and having either selling that information and that data. So now you're getting, medical advertisements, whatever it is. That has been a huge basis for litigation at this point. And so I think that, as always, these tools were created for the purpose of bringing probably a better customer experience, but they obviously have some monetary value. Under the wiretapping statute, essentially what it's saying is, and it's contemporaneous as opposed to asynchronous, but as you are contemporaneously collecting this information, you are intercepting my information for a purpose that is essentially commercial, and that's not permitted. That's the theory of the case. It may seem like a stretch, but it is surviving motions to dismiss, mostly in California and Florida, but also in other states around the country.
Okay, thank you. Jessica, I know you've litigated some of these cases also. What are some of the defenses that you've seen be successful pretty commonly in these wiretapping cases?
A few different defenses we're seeing, Deb. One we see less commonly the basis for a motion to dismiss, but one nonetheless, is whether the pixels or whatever technology is being used is obtaining or transmitting contents of an electronic communication. So as Jennifer mentioned, content is really the communication itself, what is being said. That is covered by the wiretapping laws, both California and federal. But what's not covered is record information. So record information, some courts have held, includes, among other things, a name, an address, or a subscriber number or identity. So in cases where plaintiffs haven't alleged that there's a transmission or interception of contents of a communication, we've seen some courts determine that there may not be a wiretapping claim there. Another big issue we see come up is the issue of consent. So consent is a defense to privacy claims. This includes wiretapping claims, common law claims like invasion of privacy, intrusion upon seclusion. If you've consented to the conduct you're not complaining of, you have no claim, you've consented. So we see some different claims brought here. One thing to note is that the Federal Wiretap Act only requires one-party consent. So if in a chatbot claim, for example, the company that has a chatbot on its website knows that a vendor is involved and may be getting copies of a communication, that's enough consent to defeat a privacy claim. On the other hand, California, for example, requires all parties' consent to the communication. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here, when it comes to website litigation and privacy claims, we see privacy policies in terms of use or terms of service come into play. And we've seen courts dismiss claims where the defendant can establish that the plaintiff assented to their data being shared with a third party. In other words, if the defendant told the claimant or put them on sufficient notice of the activity, including, sharing data, the plaintiff could be deemed to have consented. So some examples of courts that have dismissed privacy claims include the Northern District of California in the In re Yahoo Mail litigation case. And in this case, the court found that there was consent to the activity complained of and granted the motion to dismiss. In short, the plaintiffs were Yahoo email users who claimed that Yahoo was scanning their emails from non-Yahoo accounts and scanning for information before the emails were delivered to the Yahoo email user. However, the Yahoo pointed to evidence that to make a Yahoo email account, the user had to click a button that said create account, and under the button, there was language that said, I agree to the Yahoo terms of service and Yahoo's privacy policy with the hyperlink to both. And if you clicked on the hyperlink, the terms of service and the privacy policy said directly, we will scan your emails, and that's part of our service. By using our service, by using our email function, you consent to that. So in other words, the court found that Yahoo had disclosed what it was going to do, and that conduct was alleged as the basis for the wiretapping claims. Therefore, there was consent because plaintiffs agreed to let Yahoo do what they did. A similar case was a case against Zimride, the rideshare service. In that case, plaintiffs similarly alleged that Zimride, through the app, was disclosing information about them to a third-party analytics service. And in that case, too, the court found that there was consent because at the time the plaintiff signed up for Zimride, downloaded the app, entered their information, they were presented with terms of service and a privacy policy that said, we may use the information you provide to the app. When you take a ride or you sign up to take a ride, we may provide that to a third party. And that was the basis of the plaintiff's claims. So in that case, the court also found consent. So a real takeaway from a lot of these wiretapping cases that turn on consent is, one, what language is in the privacy policy or the terms of service? For instance, if the claimant's claim is, we didn't know you were using cookies, does the privacy policy say, we use cookies? What exactly is being disclosed? How detailed is the information? And how is it presented to the consumer? Is there a cookie banner that pops up at the bottom of the page when you land on a website with hyperlinks? Is it buried in a hyperlink at the bottom of a page that one might not see? Is it buried within other language about other aspects of the defendant's service? But to the extent you can present evidence that, the consumer had to consent, they had to click something, they were presented with terms, and the terms told them exactly what you were going to do, and that's what they, are bringing a claim based on. You may have consent, and consent is a complete defense to privacy claims.
Great, thank you so much. Now, more recently, we have seen numerous cases regarding pen register and trap and trace claims. Can you give us an overview of those, Jessica, and what are some of the issues there?
Sure, next slide, please, Jamie. Sure, so one claim we're seeing recently as the chatbot, as Jennifer mentioned, we're seeing that be the basis for federal wiretap act claims and also California invasion of privacy or HIPAA claims. So in addition to chatbot claims, what we're seeing very frequently now are pen register or trap and trace claims. So under a different provision of HIPAA, different from the wiretap provision, the California legislator holds that a person may not install or use a pen register or trap and trace device without first obtaining a court order. And when you think of a pen register or a trap and trace device, you may be thinking law enforcement. These are tools that were used to effectively generate a call log and see incoming and outbound calls. But following a 2023 decision in Greenlee versus Kuchava, plaintiffs are now bringing an onslaught of pen register or trap and trace claims based on the same analytics technology. So in this case, Greenlee, the plaintiffs allege that the defendant was selling a software developer kit, and the software developer kit was collecting data from app users, and this was the equivalent of a pen register. The court rejected the defendant's arguments on a motion to dismiss that pen register under CIPA was really constrained to a physical machine connected to a phone line. This decision that broadened the definition of what could be a pen register under CIPA has led to a wave of new claims, many of them filed at the end of 2023 and beginning of 2024. So we're keeping an eye on these cases to see how courts rule on this issue, as well as specifically whether tracking technology on a website can be a pen register or trap and trace device within the meaning of the CIPA, or whether we'll see a number of these claims get dismissed based on legislative history and interpretation of what exactly the courts and Congress meant to limit with this statute.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I would guess when those were enacted, no one was expecting to see these claims in 2024 related to the internet, but here we are, and as you mentioned, there's been a lot of them. So another state statute under which we've seen a significant amount of litigation is the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, which we refer to as BIPA. So Jennifer, can you please give us an overview of BIPA and what we're talking about here with regard to biometric information?
Thank you, Deb. So the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act essentially prohibits private companies, entities from capturing or collecting biometric data and receiving it through trade and then using it for commercial purposes. They can't necessarily, well, let me back up a little bit. Whenever I think about BIPA, I think about like any James Bond type movie, you know, whatever technology is happening in 50 years from now. And essentially what BIPA is trying to do, and it was really promoted and pushed by the Illinois ACLU, which is you have to tell people whether or not their thumbprint is, you know, to getting into their phone, whether or not that's going to be captured, how long it's going to be captured, and exactly what it's going to be used for. The second step of that is how is that information going to be protected? Because unlike a password, or to some extent, I would argue, you know, a bank account number, those things can be changed, but your facial recognition, your iris scan, your fingerprint, those are things that cannot be changed. And so Illinois, which has, you know, it's really the first of its kind in the United States. It was enacted in the early 2000s. I mean, it's really way up in front of its time, ahead of its time. But the whole purpose of it is to make sure that consumers generally know, understand, and they have some guarantees about how their biometric information is going to be used. One of the difficulties with the BIPA information is, like face recognition software, there is a significant learning curve that has not yet been conquered regarding racial identification and to some extent gender identification. And so I give an example to people, they never quite believe it, but I have 2 children, a boy and a girl. They're 5 years apart. And they can use each other's faces to open each other's iPhones using Face ID. And it's likely because they look a lot alike. But like I said, they're significantly, you know, difference in age, gender, etc. So if you think about that, and whether or not, you know, that's particularly for my family of African descent. But, you know, if facial recognition, in fact, is not differentiating between people based on, for instance, race, gender, etc., then we have the issue of can people's identities be stolen, even though it's their information, it's their biometric information. Next slide. Okay. Courts have really been very hard on plaintiffs, so they dismissed BIPA claims. If defendants cannot tell you how that information is being used for identification. So essentially, plaintiffs' attorneys, again, incredibly smart, are bringing all kinds of incredible claims. And I think I got that backwards. I'm sorry, I think I said that backwards. I said that the plaintiffs, but let me just read it. Courts have dismissed BIPA claims absent allegations that the defendant is using or is capable of using that information for identification. I said that backwards. I said plaintiffs. But in terms of courts dismissals, as a corporation, one of the things that you really want to be able to discuss is how that information is being used, or even if you are capable of using that information. At some point, plaintiffs' lawyers are going to get past this hurdle. Once they get past that hurdle, the question will be your policies, your procedures, and what is written down, and to some extent, your training.
So, Jessica, I know you've worked on some BIPA cases recently that involved virtual try-on technology. Can you describe those a little bit for us?
Sure. So we are seeing a number of cases involving, as Deb mentioned, try-on technology. So this is the type of feature where you go on a website, you're interested in buying, a certain type of eyeglasses, and before buying them, you can take your picture or upload a picture, and the website will generate an image of you wearing these eyeglasses, or the same with hair extensions or makeup products. So we're seeing a lot of courts expand, or we're seeing a lot of plaintiffs try to expand the coverage of BIPA beyond the fingerprint or the facial scan to try-on technology. So we've given you some examples of cases where, defendants were brought into BIPA suits that are not the type of company you think is doing, as Jennifer mentioned, the James Bond type of technology. So one was a case against Avita, and this was just a December 2023 case. And this involved try-on technology. And the court dismissed the claim because, as Jennifer and Deb have mentioned, BIPA really turns on, are you doing any type of identification with the information? Even if a company is collecting what counts as biometric identification or biometric information, there's no BIPA claim unless the defendant is using that information for purposes of technology. So in the Avita case, the court held that plaintiffs didn't allege that Avita was taking the consumer's images and comparing it to a database of existing customers, or that they had any kind of database and were running the images collected against the database. And just a few months ago, another Illinois district court held the same in a case against Estee Lauder, involving another makeup feature. There, the court also held that there were no allegations that Estee Lauder was comparing people's images, even if there was some kind of layering or putting on makeup and saving that image. They weren't using that to compare the people being pictured to any kind of database or to do any identification. And outside of the cosmetics context, CVS recently prevailed in getting a BIPA claim dismissed. And in this case, it involved a passport photo system. So at CVS stores, a CVS employee would take a picture of a customer with a digital camera, upload it into a Kodak system. The Kodak system would scan the picture and see, does this image comply with the federal passport requirements? Is the person positioned correctly? Is it the right size? And the court found that even if that scan of a digital picture was collecting biometric information, it was not enough to allege that CVS was using that picture for identification or comparing the person picture to any kind of database. So let's go to the next slide, please. So for contrast, there are cases where courts are denying motions to dismiss where the plaintiff does allege that there is some type of comparison or identification going on. The first case we've given as an example was a case involving a company that took plasma donations. So those plaintiffs allege that they scanned their fingerprint at a kiosk each time they went to sell plasma, and the defendant was using that fingerprint to compare that information to a database. Essentially, they were looking as, has this person been here before? and that's an identification purpose, so it was enough to survive a motion to dismiss. And in another case with some interesting technology, plaintiffs were truck drivers who alleged that there was facial recognition technology in trucks, and that technology would scan their faces and look for driver fatigue or driver distraction, and to basically regulate the driver's behavior and see if they were performing adequately. And because the image collected was being compared to existing images of the driver, that was sufficient for identification purposes and enough to overcome a motion to dismiss. So we're seeing these BIPA claims, at least for Trion Technology, really turn on whether there are allegations that the defendant can use the images collected for any type of identification purpose, and if they can, are they actually using it for any identification purpose?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So now we would like to turn to the world of data security incidents. So data breaches involve various types of unauthorized access to data, other unauthorized disclosure or unauthorized processing of data. Sometimes it's the typical hacker breaking into a network, but more often these days it's occurring via phishing and social engineering and all kinds of other different approaches, some of which involve the AI. So Dustin, can you give us an overview of some of the trends you've seen in some of the more recent significant data breaches?
Hi, Deb. Yes, of course. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. We have really a lot of different ways that attackers are really causing some really major data breaches. In terms of trends, we really are seeing the continuation of a trend through 2023, where data breaches continue to be more and more expensive year on year, and we're also seeing a trend of more and more different kinds of businesses being the victims of data breaches and security incidents. And so let me just talk about some of the key incidents that came out of 2023. And I just, before I want to dive into some of the details of these breaches, I just want to say, we don't, because these happened just in 2023, we don't necessarily know all the details about these data breaches yet. I think some more details will emerge in the months to come. But based on what we know now, I think some of the key trends really are that as you said, Deb, social engineering attacks really are becoming more common and more sophisticated and more devastating for their targets. We're seeing a real increase in data breaches that are the result of software vulnerabilities. And one of the other things I think is just a really interesting trend is we're seeing a lot more government entities or public entities being targets of attackers that want to perpetrate these data breaches or other security incidents. So for instance, in the social engineering category, MailChimp, which is a company that sends mass emails on behalf of its clients, suffered a breach of all its records related to 133 business clients. That breach was a result of a social engineering attack where an attacker obtained a variety of employees' usernames and passwords and then used them to access an internal account management tool and all the data about the business clients that was available within that tool. And this was actually the data. This was of great concern to the affected customers and to MailChimp, because the data that was taken could actually be used for more social engineering attacks on MailChimp's customers. And so that was one of the chief concerns coming out of that incident. Now, Activision had a somewhat similar incident as well. Activision is a maker of computer and video games. They suffered an SMS phishing attack, or in other words, a social engineering attack perpetrated by SMS text messaging on an HR department employee. And even though it was just a single employee, that was an HR department employee that had access to a variety of human resources data. And the investigation of the incident revealed that the compromise actually began in early December 2022, but unfortunately, Activision wasn't able to detect it until February of 2023. As a result, the attacker that compromised the HR department employee obtained employees' names, email addresses, compensation information, and the like. Activision actually was, and this goes back to some observations I'll have at the end. but they didn't actually disclose the breach immediately. They were initially persuaded that there was no data stolen during this incident, but a research group that studies cybersecurity attacks found data stolen from Activision later, and that because of that finding, there really was some questions raised about whether Activision timely notified the people that whose data was potentially compromised. Now, in the software vulnerability category, and which I think is actually a really fascinating category, because um, these kinds of incidents, because software just isn't perfect, they can happen all the time into just really any kind of company. Because, and as we'll see here, these some of these involve software that companies make for themselves, but others involve software that companies simply use. So, for instance, in the Chat GPT incident, the Chat GPT had simply utilized an open source code library, which is a very common practice, that had a vulnerability that allowed an attacker to exploit the vulnerability and obtain unauthorized access to a record to records associated with about 1% of ChatGPT's customers. And of course, the key takeaway here is, for ChatGPT and others, even if you're using open source code, even well-regarded open source code, you still have to do your security testing to make sure that code is secure when you incorporate it into your product. T-Mobile's incident actually did involve the company's their mobile app that was customer facing, and it simply contained an error. And when customers logged into the app before the error was corrected, it exposed other customers' payment data to customers that were not that customer. It wasn't, and it hasn't actually become clear how many T-Mobile customers were aware, and it appears from the initial investigations that there actually may be some difficulty determining which T-Mobile customers ultimately were affected. But again, it just really points back to the importance of careful software testing. I think the most serious of these three incidents is the MoveIt incident, which is a incident that affected a company that provides a tool for storing and sharing files and other data. And this company this was their own software, and they had a 0-day vulnerability that within their software that became public within the community of folks that do cybersecurity attacks. And multiple attackers actually exploited the vulnerability to compromise data associated with more than 1,000 of MoveIt's customers and more than 60 million individuals. And that data included financial services customers, military and government customers, healthcare sector customers, and the costs related to this incident have exceeded 10 billion so far, and likely will exceed 50 million before all is said and done. Just a very, very expensive incident. This third category I wanted to highlight really are compromises of government organizations, and I think this is an interesting trend as well, because I think not too many years ago, there was a thought like, oh, like banks and are like great targets for hackers because they've got credit card information or financial account information. But like some of our clients and some businesses out there would perhaps think to themselves, but we don't have data like that, so we would never be a target. I think some of these targets some of these attacks are just perpetrated indiscriminately by attackers who are just interested in seeing what data they can get and what use they can make of it. So the three major incidents we had here involved, the first involved the Indonesian Immigration Directorate. This was an apparent hacking attack, and the directorate has been very tight-lipped about what has actually happened. We do know that the passport data of more than 35 million people was compromised, and it was later made available for sale on the dark web for $10,000. A fact I'll come back to here in a moment. But the next incident was the UK the UK Electoral Commission, and they were actually the victim of just a malicious code vulnerability, and they too have not been able to determine the exact number of people that are affected. But the UK Electoral Commission, just as it kind of sounds like, so they have the names of voters and addresses of all voters in the UK. That's about 45 million individuals each year. The Idaho National Labs is actually a U.S. Department of Energy lab, and they were compromised in an interesting way. They were compromised by a hacking group, but the actual compromise involved an HR database that was managed by a vendor that was outside the lab itself. Nevertheless, the database still included data, a variety of data on lab employees and former employees. And these are employees who are nuclear energy researchers, national security researchers, and other individuals who are involved in very confidential work and research. And of course, the concern here is that data could be used to compromise those people, to blackmail those people, to make those secrets less safe. So, even though government or agencies haven't historically perhaps been as high profile of targets, I think it's perfectly clear that they are going to continue to be targets going forward. I also wanted to just briefly, before I moved on from this discussion of data breaches, mention 23andMe. It doesn't fall into either of any of these other categories, but I think it's just notable because 23andMe, of course, is a site that uses genetic information to sort of allow individuals to learn this information about their proclivity for developing diseases and to learn information about their ancestry. They had they were the victims of what was called a credential stuffing attack, meaning that an attacker used previously compromised usernames and passwords and tried them as usernames and passwords at 23andMe, and were indeed able to compromise about 4 million records on the service just by using those passwords. So the important safety tip for us all as users is don't use the same username and password on more than one website if you could possibly avoid it. But nevertheless, the what's so interesting about this one is that the data that was compromised included significant data on users of Ashkenazi Jewish descent and Chinese descent, and it really reveals that databases like this, when they're compromised, really enable the potential exploitation of certain classes of people based on the characteristics that are made known by those databases. So if we can move to the next slide, I think the sort of some of the key takeaways here about what we're seeing this year is that several of these data breach victims were sort of initially denied that there was a compromise, or that they may have acknowledged a security incident but denied that the data was compromised. And one of the things I think that really indicates is a vulnerability or a weakness in organizations and incident response teams, that they really don't have enough information about how to determine whether data was compromised. And usually that's done in two ways. One by looking at the systems that the companies or businesses have that keep records about data that's being transmitted in and out of the networks, in and out of systems, but also by there's specialized expertise of people who can look on the internet and find these data sets that are made available as a result of these data breaches for sale or for other exploitation. And although I did not really dive into the healthcare industry specifically in this discussion, I will say that the healthcare industry continues to be the leading industry sector for data breach costs, and those data breach costs are just like they are in every industry, just going up from year to year.
Thank you. Let's move to the next slide. And so Dustin, as Austin mentioned earlier, the FTC has sort of become the de facto federal enforcer of data privacy, data security, deeming that certain poor security practices are unfair or even deceptive if a company makes security promises and they don't keep them. Can you just give us a quick overview of some of the FTC enforcement in this area? Quickly, thanks.
Yeah, of course. So I think the key really is that although anyone can have a data breach or a security incident, the FTC really brings its enforcement powers to bear on companies that are sort of willful or reckless in terms of their security, or deceptive and make representations about their security that just aren't correct. And in the slide here, you can see some of the companies that have been targeted this year. But really, that the common threads here are misrepresentation, that they have security when they don't. Many of these companies were putting putting data on internet cloud systems that had actually no access control or very little access control, no encryption or very weak encryption, and yet we're making representations to their customers that they had strong security. One of the other things that I think the FTC is really taking advantage of are sort of egregious violations. So in the case of Ring here, which is mentioned toward the bottom, the FTC had actually alleged that the company had illegally surveilled customers in the private spaces of their homes and failed to take reasonable steps to prevent people from getting access to those videos. So the FTC required them to engage in a fairly robust remedial program that includes independent outside assessments. In many cases, the FTC is assessing significant fines, significant requirements for outside assessments. And in one case, we had a company whose CEO was actually criticized for not maintaining an adequate security program and was required to not only have an adequate security program going forward at that company, but at every other company he leads from then on out. So we're definitely seeing the FTC focus on the worst of the worst in terms of security incidents.
Well, thank you so much. So what are some key takeaways that companies should be learning from these enforcement actions, Dustin? Next slide, please.
Yeah, so key takeaways really, security governance matters. Like having a written information security program that really brings in key stakeholders, the people that are actually involved with information security, key executives, really facilitates understanding of security throughout the organization, facilitates making sure that budget dollars get spent to actually address the worst or more significant cybersecurity issues, fosters accountability, and really drives cybersecurity into the business. I think one of the other key takeaways is that most of these security incidents are preventable, and following any of the major cybersecurity frameworks, whether that's NIST or ISO or any of the other or CIS controls, if you follow them carefully, they really will produce a solid and defensible program that has a good chance of fending off some of these security incidents. Obviously, don't ignore or cover up your security issues. Don't think you're not a target just because you're a public entity or not the kind of entity that you think is going to be a target. And perhaps most importantly, the social engineering attacks because of artificial intelligence's increasing complexity and sophistication are just going to get worse. They're going to get more deceptive and just easier to fall for. So one of my key recommendations is really don't rely exclusively on individuals' judgment. I mean, we should still be doing cybersecurity awareness training, but organizations really need to turn to defense in depth, having more than one defense to these kinds of attacks. So I think those really are the key takeaways from the security incidents this year and in years prior.
Thanks. And then I know we're at time, but let's just go to the next slide quickly, just to note that the SEC recently introduced a new rule relating to security incident response and reporting for public companies. This just went into effect in December. So we assume most of our public company clients are aware of this, but just in case you're not, this is, a critical new disclosure obligation. So, be sure you're aware of this. Please reach out to your Dorsey attorneys if you're not aware of it. If you're not a Dorsey client and you have questions, feel free to, reach out to any of us who, in the US who have presented today, not necessarily our international colleagues. And there are some, short time frames here. So, really need to prepare with your incident response plans and your whole executive team. All right. I think we need to wrap it up. Thank you. Do we have time to go through these? Lori? I'm not sure if we do.
I think you can take like another minute and then we'll need to.
Okay. All right, great. Okay, Jennifer, do you want to just give us some quick planning for prevention with regard to preventing cybersecurity incidents, please?
Sure. I think that the most important thing is that most cyber breaches are caused by human error. usually through email or some type of phishing or compromised hardware. And so it's very important for employee training to understand, for your employees to understand what it is their obligations are. The other part that's really very important right now is your master services agreements and how your vendors are protecting your data. That seems to be a very big vulnerable spot right now. So you need to make sure that your master services agreements, et cetera, are up to date so that your vendors understand the level and the type of security that you require with your data. Essentially, it is about prevention. It's about tabletops. It's about looking forward into what may happen. But that's certainly something that we can advise you on. I don't want to take any more time for today, but I'm more than happy to answer questions later.
Can we just wrap up here? I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much to our panel, our third panel, and all of our panels for all the great information that you shared today. And thanks to all of our attendees for coming and thinking about all these important issues. You'll see we have speaker biographies at the end of the materials if you want to learn more about any of the people who spoke. And remember to return your sign-in sheet to attendance@dorsey.com so you can get CLE credit. And we're happy to be in touch with anybody who has questions after the fact. So thanks so much again, and have a good rest of your day.